Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Victim Support Europe's annual conference, The Age of Resilience. I am absolutely delighted to welcome you all here to the sunny Malta. Being from Ireland, obviously the sun is not something we see often, so I'm a little bit giddy from the sun, but also might pass out with the heat by lunchtime, so if you see me falling over, someone help with water or wine, whatever. That works too. But can I begin by expressing my thanks to the European Commission, the Ministry for Home Affairs, the National Security and Law Enforcement of Malta, the Ministry for Justice of Malta, Victim Support Agency Malta, as well as our host, our full member of Victim Support Europe, Victim Support Malta, who have helped us organise this wonderful conference over the next 2 days. Can I also thank all of you as Victim Support members for your long-standing support of our organisation and your attendance here both online and in person today. Such involvement illustrates your long-standing commitment to supporting and protecting victims' rights, rights which have recently faced new challenges, firstly by the pandemic and then more recently by the humanitarian crisis caused by the war in Ukraine. Both of these events have had a devastating impact on millions of individuals, families and communities across Europe. Indeed, the pandemic has shed light on and exacerbated existing inequalities between and within countries. The long-term consequences of the pandemic are still difficult to foresee, and new problems related to it continue to come to light. The public health crisis has offered an opportunity to place equality at the heart of all governmental and civil society measures to combat inequalities. This will allow organisations and governments be better prepared for and to continue to contribute to public resilience in the aftermath of future crises. Simultaneously, gender equality has never been so high on the EU's political agenda. Since the adoption of its gender equality strategy over a year ago, the Commission has made significant efforts to implement this strategy. EU law has many unique instruments to support and strengthen Member States' capacity in complying with victims' rights and standards. I would of course mention the EU Directive on Victims' Rights, which is the main EU instrument which is applicable to victims of all crimes, and the recent proposal for a directive on combating violence against women and domestic violence. This proposed directive, drafted under the leadership of Commissioner Helena Dalli, will cover criminal offences including rape, female genital mutilation and cyber violence, including non-consensual sharing of intimate images, cyber stalking, cyber harassment and cyber incitement to violence and hatred. The new rules will also strengthen victims' access to justice and encourage members to consider a one-stop shop mechanism locating all support and protection services in the same place. I would stress the importance of the Victims' Rights Directive evaluation, which was launched by the European Commission last year to assess to what extent it has achieved its objectives, both in terms of the implementation of it and also the practical application in EU countries. We at Victim Support Europe believe that this evaluation is essential as the implementation of the directive still remains largely unsatisfactory. Now is the time for the European Commission to determine the cause and the reasons behind the non-implementation and to take appropriate action as required. We encourage the European Commission to follow up on infringement proceedings against Member States who are reluctant to abide by their obligations under different EU law. To be successful, this requires setting out best practice and determining whether legislation is sufficient enough and is sufficiently clear enough in terms of its objectives, and also how such legislation should be amended. It is the duty of Member States to protect the lives and well-being of all members of society, specifically by ensuring equitable access to victim support services, with particular attention being given to those most vulnerable. Some individuals and groups are, as we all know, systematically disadvantaged when it comes to accessing victims' rights and services across their countries. Groups such as victims of gender-based violence, victims of cross-border crime, people with disabilities, migrants and refugees. Strategies, therefore, must be developed to ensure that they receive appropriate support, which should include the removal of those barriers preventing them from accessing the help that they need. International cooperation is instrumental in achieving this objective and ensuring better public crisis preparedness for the future. Our annual conference provides a unique platform in which to exchange good practice and to support member states' efforts to address the challenges at hand. Our discussion aims to highlight the means to achieve resilience, individual, social and structural, by sharing strategies and approaches which we can all adopt. I would encourage all EU countries to join our victim support community so that the pan-European common home, so to speak, becomes stronger and more better prepared for the future. A common home where no victim is left behind, where all individuals are treated equally, and have, in particular, equitable access to victim support services regardless of crime type. I trust that our conference, discussions today and over the next few days will contribute to the above objectives, and I would take this opportunity to thank all speakers who have kindly agreed to share their experience and thinking with us over the next few days. I would also like to particularly thank all of you who have travelled here in person. I hope to get to speak to you all at some stage over the next day or two. And I would now like to hand over to our Executive Director for Victim Support Europe, Levin Dalton, who is going to go through some housekeeping. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Good morning, everyone. How are you all doing? Good? It's a beautiful day, so I'm very happy. I know, I'm feeling it as well. I can't take my jacket off now anyway. So it's... Say again? Take the shirts off here. No, that's for later. Thanks, Jerry. So, first of all, it's an absolute pleasure to see you all. Old faces, new faces, young faces, any faces. It's good to see any faces, I think that's the point, isn't it? So I feel that there's a buzz. It's been 2 years since our last face-to-face conference, so we're really happy to be together as one big family, as we should be. What I will do, first of all, now is just go through the usual housekeeping so everyone knows what's happening and where to go in the event of some disaster of some kind, because it is the age of resilience. So for fire safety and housekeeping, in the event of a fire, the fire alarm will operate. Surprisingly, we have to immediately evacuate the building. So you need to exit through the venue through the emergency doors, which are on the right, as I understand it. And if you find the exit blocked, if Jerry's having a wine over there, then just follow the standard fire exit signs, which will indicate the shortest route. We have restrooms on the ground floor. There are 2 sets, as I understand it. I saw that there were queues, so there are 2 sets of restrooms. The coffee break and the lunch will take place in the foyer area. The coffee break, the lunch is a stand-up lunch, and that's all on the ground floor. This is something that's good news. I was supposed to say that when we're moving around, we have to wear a mask, but we don't have to wear a mask anymore, so thank you, Malta, for the change in their rules. Just especially for us. No, that's right. The conference is also held in hybrid mode, so we have people online listening in. It's being broadcast live on Zoom, so if you are an online participant, feel free to use the chat box, make comments. As much as possible, we'll try to answer any of those questions that you share with us. In terms of timekeeping, we have Leah, who's our policy officer, with the all-important high-tech 5 minutes and 1 minute signs. That's for all of the speakers. Just so you're aware, we are recording, but the recording is all of the speakers, and then we'll make that available online for everyone if you want to watch any of those speeches again. So that's all the housekeeping. I'm not going to hold us up anymore. We have an absolutely amazing speaker to kick us off. Those of you who know Victim Support Europe, we always say the voice of victims is the primary thing that we have to focus on, which is why I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Colm Smith to speak for us and to open the conference. He is a survivor of the Loughinisland Massacre in Northern Ireland, so please, Colm, thank you.
It really is a pleasure to be here today, and part of my job over the next 15 minutes is really to give some context to the great work that all of you do. I've been very lucky to avail of the services that have been provided to me over the years, and also not provided because of some of the challenges that you face. And that's important that you're here over the next couple of days and continue to collaborate and work together. And hopefully what happened to me and my story as only one element of a victim of crime will definitely help you to push forward in your endeavors. So this is the scene of my trauma. This is a small pub in rural County Down, 1994. This is the view from the front door of that pub. So the pub itself is about 30 feet long, so about half as deep as this room, and about 15 feet wide. So a very typical Northern Ireland country pub. There was only 15 people in the pub that night when it was attacked. I would have been sitting just about here, so somewhere right in the middle. I'm going to give you a little extract. One of the things that I was very lucky, as I mentioned later on, is that I'm married to a woman who works in a similar sector to yourselves, but with young children. And when I first met her, before we got married, she told me keeping a diary would be a good idea and write those thoughts down and get them out of my head. And so this comes from a little bit of that. The first thing I seen was flashes of lights in the mirror behind the bar, followed by an assault rifle and the roar as dozens and dozens of bullets entered that room. Out of the 15 men that were in that room watching a soccer match on the TV, 6 of them died. It only took 30 seconds. I lay on the floor just here, where that stool is. And I could see 4 men laying in front of me, one body lying on top of another where they fell. The oldest man in the room was Barney Green. He was 87 years old. And he was also my mum's cousin. Behind me, to the right, lay the 5th body. That man tried to dive out of the room through an exit door, and he was gunned down as he tried to do that. And his body was half in and half out of that pub. He was right behind my shoulder. The 6th man lay on top of me. His name was Malcolm Jenkinson. Malcolm Jenkinson was somebody I knew from I was a kid. His son was my best friend. When the shooting started, Malcolm turned towards me and pushed me back, and that's what saved my life. He was shot once in his leg. It hit an artery. By the time we fell to the ground, he was already dying. I held him in my arms, and I prayed the Our Father. I didn't know what else to do. And then he died. As I looked around me, I could see all that blood on the floor that you can see, except it wasn't dry then. It was a living, breathing thing, and it was moving towards me. And I also noticed that my own blood was moving towards it. I'd been shot 4 times. I hadn't realized that at that stage. Once in my left leg, twice in my right thigh, which blew most of my thigh away, and once in the stomach. The fear I felt at that moment was totally overpowering. The room was still, silent, except for one thing. The soccer match that we went out to watch was still playing on the TV behind me. The world was still moving on, but we weren't. I realized at that moment that I was changed as a person. At 10:15 p.m. on 18th of June, 1994, that's when the old Colm Smith died. And a new version of me was created that day. A damaged version. So over the years, this is 28 years ago now, it's still traumatizing for me to talk about it. I very rarely ever do. I try to focus on what happened next. But the one thing that happened back then that thankfully you guys have been working to change is that there was a lack of communication, a lack of provision of services, a lack of human compassion. There was very little for us. I have been able to build resilience bit by bit over the years, and it's been extremely difficult. The eternal question that I always had was, why did I have to do it without help? And this quote from Zadisa Brown, who is an artist, an activist, and a filmmaker from the US, really sums up how I feel to this day. You know, I'm exhausted by strength. I want support. That's what I want. I'm an academic. I'm a lecturer in marketing. So obviously, this is where I go to first, is how do I help explain what I feel? So before today, I went to our friend Google. Not Google Scholar, by the way, so forgive me. But just Google. And I found the work of Dr. Richard Tedeschi, The 5 Elements of Growth. And they really did make sense to me. They helped me to understand and put in context how I was feeling. These are the things that help us build resilience, and I feel they do apply well. The first one is those deeper interpersonal relationships. I was very lucky. I put under mine the warmth of her hand. I'm not trying to be soppy. It's the truth. There was nights when I would have night terrors. I've had dreams where I would feel I was battling against the devil for my very soul. The fear, the anxiety, everything was a battle every night. And sometimes there was nothing that my wife Shirley could do except hold me. But by doing that, we found an intimacy in terms of our communication that I didn't have with other people, which meant that we could open up to each other and we could talk about why I was feeling the way I was feeling. And that really helped me to build and understand what was going on. I can't stress the importance. I was lucky. I had that person beside me every day. I met her 4 months after Loughinisland, and I was very lucky. But those relationships are so important. The second one is greater strength. I used to have this mantra. I was so proud of it. You have to remember it's 28 years since Loughinisland, so I've had lots of movement along the way. But for many years, I used to say, Loughinisland did not define me. I was wrong. I only realized that actually it was always going to be part of me. It defined me in some way. And I had to accept that. And once I was able to accept that Loughinisland will always define part of who I am, I was able to manage and understand and process my feelings. We can't block it out. We have to accept that we're different once we go through an event. New possibilities, personal goals. This one I excel at. If there's nothing I get right, it's doing stuff. So I've got 2 master's degrees. I started my PhD at 51 years old. I was a marketing manager for 18 years. I gave it up and I went back to lecturing, and now I love that. I've traveled the world as a marketing manager. I learned how to juggle. I learned how to play a guitar. I was the kids' local soccer coach. My God, if there was anything. But it was really important. Having a goal, a simple one like learning how to juggle, which is just definitely something everybody should do, because there's so much joy in that alone, especially when you get it right. But those things do help us focus. The one thing that I realize, and I don't know whether it's just me or whether it's something that follows victims, is that I needed something I could win at, something I could control, because I couldn't control so much of what was going on in my life. It was really important. 4, to make others happy, I needed to be happy. This was a really difficult one. This was at the moment in my life after being with Shirley for over 10 years when you said, if you don't get counselling, you're out. And we had to have those types of conversations at some point because I wasn't happy. And because I wasn't happy, I wasn't the best husband in the world. I wasn't a bad husband. I was just very moody and very grumpy and, would take to the bed every now and again because I was depressed and couldn't quite cope up with what was going on. And I wasn't the best dad either for the exact same reasons. So I had to be selfish. I had to get help. The problem I had back in the 90s and the early 90s is there was no VSE. It was so hard. Nobody offered help. But once I got into counselling, I realised the power of that. And I was able to recognise and understand what was going on. And I got happier. I can remember the first session. I've never cried so much in my life. The guilt I felt for being alive. The profound grief for those that I had lost that night. The grief I had for a life I would never live. That was so damaging to me, and I was holding it in for so many years. But once I was able to go to counselling and access those therapies, it made a huge difference to my life. Number 5, I realised the successes and downplay went wrong. This comes from 4. I started, for so many years, I would focus on the negative things in my life, and they would become the dominant force. Why am I not a better father? Why am I not a better husband? Why do I not do so well at work? Damn that Loughinisland, damn the UVF, damn the terrorists. There was a lot of that going on in my life. And then I started to focus on the good things. Today is a good thing. I will find this difficult. When I wrote this speech last week, my wife will tell you, I was depressed for about a day. Yes. But I was willing to accept that because I wanted to do this. I very rarely ever talk about the actual day. I'll talk about therapy and getting help, but very rarely do I go back in my mind and relive it. But today's a good day, and I focus on that rather than on the negative, which is those hard memories. Really important. Now for a little bit of the academic stuff, because this is what I want you to think. I was very lucky last night. I was sitting with Jerome, Moreau, and Rota Jensen, and Robin, and I really got to learn a little bit, and Tobias, and I got to learn a little bit about what's going on in the Netherlands and what's going on in Austria, and it was really, really good. And they have some things that we don't have in Ireland. And I think the reason why you're in this room is that everybody needs to have access to the same things in every European country. That's what I want. That would be something that would be really powerful. This is what I had back in 1994. I was asked 3 days after I was shot, do you want counselling? Can you guess what my response was? Yeah. I'm grand. I'm fine. Honest to God, I'm all right. I was still in shock, obviously. No one ever asked me again. That was 28 years ago. Never in 28 years has anybody approached me and say, on behalf of the government or whatever, how can we help you? Anytime I've got counselling since, I've sought it out. And we're doing a session later on today on digital and the use of digital communication. And thank God for COVID, because these services went online and I was able to access the work of the Wave Trauma Centre in Northern Ireland because they went online. And that was the first time that I was able to speak to somebody who grew up in Northern Ireland about what happened to me. That was 28 years later. I got no medical help to attend funerals. This may seem such a trivial thing, but 3 days after I was shot, and those 6 men died, all their funerals were held on the same day, which is tradition in Ireland to have them so close. I wanted to go, and I had to sign myself out of hospital. I wasn't provided with any medical help. I wasn't provided with any transport. It was like, well, if you're going to those hospitals, go by yourself. More trauma. No financial support. I got a cheque for £10,000 a year after I was shot. I didn't know what to do with that money. You know, it's compensation has to be done in a way that is understandable and commensurate with what's happened, but also in a way that the victim can accept and understand what's going on with this. Giving somebody money does not make us happy. But it's very hard to do it right, and most of the time it was never done right. We have a new process in the north, which Geraldine, I'm sure, you know about, which is the victims' pensions, which is to help people who went through the troubles, and I've applied for that, which is more trauma, because you have to go back and tell them everything all over again. I got an email from them yesterday after 7 months to say that my case had been referred to their medical team, which means that I now need to provide a medical, face-to-face medical, to prove that I am who I say I am. It baffles belief. I mean, if they want to know just how bad I am, just ask my wife. She'll tell you how messed up I am. I don't need a medical, and I shouldn't. These are things that need to be fixed. The legal process is also something I'm really passionate about. As I say, I spoke yesterday at dinner, and in the Netherlands, I spoke with Robin, who talked a lot about how they help victims go through the court process. I have no legal standing in Ireland or in the north on what happened to me. I've never seen investigations. Anytime I've requested anything, it's always been redacted to the point where it's useless. I had no representation in court. I have no access to any information whatsoever. I'm a bystander in my own case. Politicians know more than I do. And that is really damaging for victims who feel that what happened to them is actually nothing to do with them in its own way. I've had 2 conversations with the police service in 28 years. 2 conversations in 28 years. Both of those were, hi, we're your police liaison officer. We're going to keep in contact with you. You know, thank you very much. Can we get your email? Can we get your telephone number? And then I never heard from them again. And what we do is that I hear it on the radio. I read it in a paper. I've had instances a couple of times over the years where I've almost crashed my car, where I'm driving to work, doing my normal thing and maybe, you know, doing well. And then I hear on the radio that somebody's been arrested in connection with the Loughinisland massacre, because it's a big event in Northern Ireland. Nobody bothered to tell us. Your heart stops when that happens. Some of you have experienced trauma, I know that. So you know what I mean. It literally grabs you by the heart and it squeezes so hard. And it shouldn't happen. It's such a simple thing to let people know what is happening. No protection from the media. In events that are very public, this is something that is really important too. Victims are not experienced trauma experts. We have no idea what the media is going to do to us. And we've all made mistakes because we trusted people we shouldn't. And what happened? 6 days after I left the hospital, wasn't even a week since Loughinisland. 6 days later, I left and I was on my own from that day forward. Never since the day I left hospital have I ever been contacted by a government or a health employee in the north of Ireland or in the south of Ireland and anybody asked me how I was doing. Never. I know that's not the case today, but in some countries it still is. In some countries it's still happening. So services I need, and P.S., I still don't have any of these. Geraldine, do you hear that? One of the things I would love to see is that obviously I've got the benefit of counselling, but I had to go and seek it out. So I think it would be really important that if people were offered counselling, you keep offering that counselling every 3 months until the time is right for them, and then put a plan in place. It shouldn't be well, we asked them 3 times, that's enough. Nobody knows when their trauma is going to kick in. It does it at some weird times for me. Sometimes I'm watching a movie and somebody gets shot and I'm back in 1994. It is literally like Back to the Future. You just go through time. And you don't know when you need that person to speak to. Financial support. Financial support is not about allowing me to have a holiday home in the south of France so I can go and be depressed there. That is not what it's about. Financial support is that I can feed my children, put a roof over my head, pay my electricity and water bill in the immediate aftermath of something like that. I went back to college 4 months after, and I struggled through my degree, and I got there by the grace of God, and a lot of hard graft, and a lot of medication. I really had to struggle through that. The first job I took after college, I think I lasted probably about 7 or 8 months. And then it got too much for me. I wasn't ready. But I had no choice. Who was going to pay my bills? Nobody cared. Nobody cared. Legal protection. We've said this again. You know, I think what the lads are doing in Austria and the Netherlands, which is the only 2 countries I spoke to last night, so I'm not giving a dig at everybody else. But I think victims having somebody by their side to educate them on what's happening, to access the criminal files and be able to go through that with them and explain to them what the situation is, all of those things. This is not about us wanting to know the evidence against the guilty party. I know who shot me. Everybody knows who shot me. That's not the point. The point is that I didn't understand the process. I couldn't process it. It's part of our trauma to try and understand what is going on around us. Police liaison, but with a legal implementation process. Somebody saying, here's your police liaison officer is no good if that police liaison officer never speaks to you. But you have been assigned one, so they tick the box. There has to be a process of engagement with that to help us understand what's going on. And it must be available across all jurisdictions. I mean, we know that. You guys, I know, are working so hard on that. When I moved 4 months after the shooting, I went back to college to start my second year. And I never returned to Northern Ireland. I decided that it was much easier for me to live somewhere else. But because I moved jurisdictions, I died again in the eyes of the services in Northern Ireland. I was no longer their problem, and that was it. We need to be able to provide victims with the ability to choose where they want to live and have access to the services that they need all the time. Finally, I'm sorry, and I'm probably run on a long list, so apologies. This is why I'm here today. These are the 6 men that died that night. I'm not going to go through their biographies or whatever. But the reason I put myself up here today and want to speak to you, and I really want to make a very strong impression on you, I've been able to achieve resilience through a bit of luck, through a lot of love and care from my family and my wife Shirley, and from some counsellors I've met along the way. So I can deal with a little bit of re-traumatization, because they never will get the chance to build resilience. They will never get the chance to learn from the good work that you do. So remember the victims who are here and do what you can for them, because we remember the victims that aren't here. Thank you.
Thank you, Colm. And I appreciate that was a difficult process for you to prepare for and deliver today. So on behalf of everybody here and online, I do want to thank you for sharing your personal experience of trauma and also your recovery journey. And I think it speaks to the support that you had around you and your wife, Shirley, and your family support and those other professionals who have played a part in that journey in terms of the resilient man that is standing in front of us today. And I suppose for all of us, we know from our work with victims that every victim's experience is personal, but running through all of them, we see themes, and we hear it again in Colm's, his story, his journey, themes around communication, lack of information, insensitivity, lack of sometimes thought that isn't deliberate. But the impact can be so profound on someone who has experienced a trauma. And that's why it's so important, the work that we all do. Resilience is kind of, it's the word of the moment, isn't it? We all are talking about resilience. What we talked about 10 years ago was probably resilience as well. We just called it something different. So whatever we call it, it's important. And it's something that across all of our member states, we're not getting right yet in terms of equipping people with all of the skills and the support. But there's a lot to be learned from each other. And even just Colm's recount of last night's discussion with different countries, that's why Victim Support Europe is so important, because we come together as members and we share what works well in our member countries, but we also share what's not working not so well, but we take things from each other, and that's what today is about, it's what tomorrow is about, and it's what our continuous online engagement with each other is about. So lots of work to do, but progress is being made slowly but surely, and that's the benefit of all coming together. So thank you again, Colm, and you've set the tone for the next 2 days in terms of the issues that we're working to address and will continue to work to address. So that takes us to our opening speaker, which is the Commissioner for Justice, Commissioner Didier Reynders from the European Commission. Unfortunately, he can't be with us in person today, but he has pre-recorded a speech. So the powers of technology, I am going to hand over to Commissioner Reynders, I think.
Ladies and gentlemen, the motto you have chosen for this conference, the Age of Resilience, could not be more fitting for the times we are living through now. Today, we are confronted with challenges that are testing our capacity and our resilience as a society and as individuals. In the past 2 years, our resilience has been tested with the pandemic. We saw domestic violence tragically rise as the abused were locked down with their abusers. We saw the rise of hate crime as the social tensions intensified. And we saw the rise of cybercrime as our lives abruptly moved to the online world. Today, the Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine is the most imminent challenge to our resilience as a society and again as individuals. Europe is now welcoming millions of refugees fleeing from the war in Ukraine. Many of those refugees are victims of war crimes. We must ensure that they are welcomed, supported, and protected. Since the start of the Russian invasion, the world has been witnessing the atrocities committed in Bucha, Kramatorsk, and other Ukrainian cities. those responsible for the war crimes in Ukraine must be held accountable for their crimes, as justice must be given to the victims. Therefore, the Commission has proposed to empower the EU agency Eurojust with the capacity to intervene in collecting evidence and coordinating with Member States and the International Criminal Court. The investigations, gathering the evidence and proceedings will be part of our reality in the months and probably years to come. We must ensure that victims are always in the center of all our actions related to war crimes. To be able to accommodate the specific needs of victims of war crimes, we must ensure that the European Union has solid structures for victim support, protection, and access to justice. Such structures must be resilient. It means that they must be always accessible to all victims, including during the pandemic or war. This is the perspective that will guide us when revising the EU rules on victims' rights. The Victims' Rights Directive entered into application 10 years ago. It has considerably improved victims' access to justice, to support and protection in the European Union. Nonetheless, as identified in the evaluation of the Victims' Rights Directive, there is a space for improvement. This is why the Commission will propose the revision of the Rights Directive. The objective is to ensure that the European Union rules on victims' rights are resilient, that they respond to the fast-changing geopolitical situation, and that they are aligned with the requirements of the digital and environmental transitions that the European Union is currently undergoing. It will be achieved by ensuring that the new rules respond to the following 5 specific objectives. 1. To ensure victims have the information they need to exercise their rights. 2. That victims' needs for protection are met in accordance with their needs. 3. That victims benefit from generic and dedicated support services. 4. That victims have effective access to justice in all circumstances. 5. That victims have better access to compensation and restoration. I plan to table the proposal to revise the Victims' Rights Directive by the end of this year. To conclude, my message to you today is that the European Commission shares your view that this is truly an age where our resilience is being put to the test. Be it by ensuring that we provide support and protection to those who are most vulnerable among victims, including victims of war crimes, or by strengthening the legal support across Europe with better EU legislation, the Commission is doing all it can to strengthen resilience for victims. Thank you.
He can hear our clapping. Thank you, Commissioner Reynders. And I suppose both Commissioner Reynders and our next 2 speakers, actually, his presence here today really shows the commitment of the EU actors and government to change for victims, and that change really being delivered in partnership with civil society to improve the rights and services that are available to victims, to ensure that the protection and support that Colm talked about that was so lacking in his experience is available for victims. And that is an ongoing commitment, and one that I think over the last probably decade, we are really seeing government and NGOs working together to ensure that we can wrap around victims in order to place them at the centre of those initiatives, as Commissioner Reynders spoke about. Now, our next speaker is no stranger to Victim Support Europe and has worked very closely with us over many years. We did loan her out to Commissioner Dalli to do some work on the violence against women strategy more recently, but she has now returned back into under Commissioner Reynders' remit and was working again closely with us and continued good work with us in terms of the Victims' Rights Directive. So I would like to introduce you to Katarzyna Janicka-Pawlowska, who is the European Commission's coordinator for victims' rights. And I'm sure I got that completely wrong in terms of pronunciation, but Kasia, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much, Gary. No worries. I'm used to having my name pronounced in different ways. No problem at all. And I believe we still have a message from Commissioner Dalli. So maybe after my speech, please make sure that she can also say a couple of words about victims' rights. Minister, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, dear members of the victims' rights community, it's a real pleasure for me to be here today on the beautiful island of Malta and be able to speak to you in person while looking at so many familiar and friendly faces. So I really would like to thank Victim Support Malta and Victim Support Europe for organizing this event and for allowing us to meet in this forum. Also, I would like to very warmly thank Colm for your beautiful testimony, because it really brings us the perspective, the context of why we are doing all this work for victims. I have one main message for you. In the European Commission, we are serious about victims' rights, and we are serious about resilience of victims' rights. Important statements have been made by Commissioner Reynders. Commissioner Dalli also has her part of statements and the message. As the European Commission coordinator for victims' rights, I can assure you that in the Commission, we do understand the importance of resilience of EU victims' rights for the well-functioning of our criminal law systems, but also for the well-being of our societies. The concept of resilience is enshrined in the EU victims' rights strategy, adopted almost 2 years ago, and the concept is also present in our current work on the revision of the Victims' Rights Directive. The Victims' Rights Directive is a good instrument. In theory, it should already respond to all the needs that you have so beautifully presented, Colm. And in the past 10 years, since its adoption, the Victims' Rights Directive has largely contributed to improving the situation of victims in European Union. But we all know very well that still not all victims can fully rely on their rights. It comes from the EU strategy on victims' rights. It became evident in the evaluation of the Victims' Rights Directive. In particular, the evaluation has shown that certain provisions of the Victims' Rights Directive are still too vague. So we may need to add more clarity and precision to the member states' obligations in relation to victims' rights, so that victims can better rely on their rights, also in the national courts, and that the needs of victims are better catered for, also in practice. So even though the basic needs of victims have not changed in the past 10 years, the situation in which victims today exercise their rights has changed dramatically in the past 10 years. And that's why the objective of the revision of the Victims' Rights Directive is to ensure that the EU rules meet the requirements of the fast-changing world, and that they are, as much as possible, future-proof. With the EU rules, we must build resilient structures so that victims can rely on them in any circumstances. And that's why, as stressed by Commissioner Reynders, within the revision of the Victims' Rights Directive, we will take into account the current geopolitical situation. We will take into account the lessons learned from the pandemic and the lessons that we are still currently learning from the war which is on the doorstep of our union. We will take the requirements of the ongoing transitions, digital and environmental. The topics of the conference today are timely and relevant. Later on today, we will discuss the challenges related to providing support and protection to those fleeing wars and conflict. Many of them are victims of international crime. War crimes, crime against humanity, or maybe even genocide. The ongoing investigations in Ukraine will assess the actual nature of those crimes. But we must ensure that those victims of international crime receive in the EU the support and the protection that responds to their individual needs. I am aware that many victim support organizations are already very busy with providing support to refugees, in particular in those member states that receive the largest number of refugees. I know that this work is challenging. I'm also aware that often this work is done at the expense of the regular work. And that is why it is so crucial, it is so important that we discuss these challenges today at this forum. Tomorrow, the second day of the conference is dedicated to empowering specific groups of victims in relation to COVID-19 pandemic. I believe that Commissioner Dalli will, in her message, speak about the shadow pandemic with a rise of violence against women and domestic violence. The recently adopted proposal for a directive on violence against women and domestic violence constitutes an important benchmark for the revision of the Victims' Rights Directive. The proposal on violence against women not only seeks to criminalize certain forms of violence against women, but it also proposes a set of rights when it comes to support and protection of victims. Those rights, which are relevant for all victims of all crimes, will be, of course, followed in the revision of the Victims' Rights Directive. But the Victims' Rights Directive is so much more than providing specialist support and protection to victims of violence against women and domestic violence. Within the revision of the Victims' Rights Directive, we will make sure that the needs of victims of a regular crime are duly taken into account. We will also make sure that the needs of more vulnerable victims or victims with specific needs, such as victims of international crime, victims of hate crime, victims of environmental crime, victims of cyber crime, to mention a few, will also find the provisions in the revised Victims' Rights Directive that will cater for their specific needs. It will be done via the concept of individual assessment of victim-specific needs, specialized support, and protection in accordance with each victim's individual needs. If you have any ideas or observations, any ideas of concepts or things that you believe should be strengthened or put differently in the new version of the Victims' Rights Directive, you are very much welcome to inform us about it within the ongoing open public consultation on the Commission website. It is open until the end of May. So please do not hesitate. We are looking forward to your input. Also, within the next 2 days, I'm here available for discussions if you would like to exchange with me. Later on, I'm also available and I'll be happy to receive your emails on my email account of EC Coordinator of Victims' Rights. So thank you very much again. Well, just to wrap up, I really would like to join my commissioners, Commissioner Reynders, Commissioner Dalli, in thanking you for the good work you're doing for victims every day. And I wish you and myself many fruitful discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kasia. Please heed Katarzyna's words. Kasia's been around working on victims' rights now for 9 years. I think when I came over to VSE, Kasia joined the victims team, and they genuinely listen. So I think you've been to every one of our conferences over those 9 years. So we have a commission which is really listening, really wants to make a difference, and of course you have to balance the demand, many competing demands often. So, but that's a genuine request. We know that we are listened to when we intervene and when we say things. Kasia came from Commissioner Dalli's cabinet. She's now returned as the coordinator, EU coordinator for victims under Didier Reynders, which is why it's now the nice bridge where we'll hear from Commissioner Reynders again on video. Thank you. Dalli, sorry, Dalli. You've already heard Reynders. Thank you.
Challenging times require heightened resilience to stay strong and overcome difficulties. This is particularly demanding for more vulnerable victims, especially during times of crisis, such as the pandemic or the current war. When the global COVID-19 pandemic set in, we quickly realized that there was a shadow pandemic that was spreading fast. It was the rise of domestic violence and violence against women that shot up significantly on the previous already high incidence rate. For instance, a 70% increase was recorded in the Belgian region of Flanders during the second week of the first lockdown. Every single victim is one victim too many. Yet, inadequate responses to gender-based violence and domestic violence and anomalies to existing systems leave many women and girls violated, unsupported and unprotected by the judicial system. Currently, the EU is welcoming millions of refugees fleeing the war in Ukraine. No war is gender-neutral. We keep on receiving worrying reports about the suffering of women and children, about systemic rape and sexual violence being used as a weapon of war. We must do all that we can to ensure that all victims of atrocities receive the support and protection they need. This is especially so for survivors of sexual violence and rape. To ensure that the EU is well equipped to support the victims and to prevent violence against women and domestic violence, on the 8th of March, the Commission proposed a directive on violence against women and domestic violence. The proposal seeks to criminalize certain forms of violence against women, including rape, which includes all non-consensual body penetration, and online violence, such as non-consensual sharing of intimate images. Once adopted, this new law would demand dedicated helplines for victims of violence. This will be strengthened further through a harmonized EU-wide number that will direct victims to the right services and authorities wherever they are in the EU. I thank Victim Support Europe and all the organizations present today for the great work you do for victims and survivors.
Thank you, Commissioner Dalli. Now, we've just had the sort of overview from the European level. It's now time to take our focus locally to our host country of Malta. I am delighted to introduce you to the Minister of Home Affairs, Byron Camilleri. My pronunciations are going to be rubbish throughout today, so apologies to everybody in advance. It was a delight to meet the Minister this morning, and we got to talk a little bit about the work that is ongoing in Malta to improve the services of victims, and also some of the focus on victims of certain types of crime, such as hate crime, and training for police, etc. So there's a lot of good work going on in Malta, which is great to hear from. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Minister Camilleri.
So, good morning to everyone, and I'm glad to be here today with you, like-minded individuals present in Malta, and I'm glad to hear that some of you are enjoying our weather. You'll not enjoy it in summer, though. It's too hot. So, brief introduction. I'm Byron Camilleri. I'm the Home Affairs Minister, and I'm responsible also for victim support. We believe that victim support is pivotal, and related discussions ought to be considered equally important. And such conference, such as the one we are attending here today, are essential not only to jointly discuss best practices, available services, and what ought to be improved, but also to convey the message that no victim is on his or on her own. And as avid ambassadors in this field, you are undoubtedly aware that the victim's first major step is for them to speak up. For the most part, this would initially require some word of encouragement. Unfortunately, we all know that this critical step is typically the hardest step. And that should be our starting point here today. Humbly, I believe that in this country, Malta, we managed to make a turnaround when it comes to victim support. In the past few years, awareness has increased substantially, whilst the narrative, the local narrative, has changed, thanks to the collective effort of NGOs working in this field, together with government entities. For long stretches of time, the perpetrators of any form of aggression, violence, and even somewhat much more serious crime took center stage. It was far more important to us, to the local system, to ensure that these people are brought to justice and subsequently punished, whilst the victims were hardly ever mentioned, let alone provided for. Yes, it's undeniably important that these people who break the law in one way or another are brought to justice. We have a duty to see that our communities are safe, and as minister responsible for security and for the police, I must appeal for this to continue. However, it is equally important that these victims are provided with the required support in many forms during such difficult and vulnerable times. So this reasoning led us to establish the Malta Victim Support Agency back in 2021, merely a year ago. This agency provides free holistic support to victims of crime and is comprised of victim support members of the police force and the multidisciplinary team of professionals offering psychological and legal help, amongst others. The agency serves as a point of reference for victims of crime who often felt lost and overwhelmed by the lack of coordination between the entities which are meant to protect them. I had numerous encounters with victims of crime in my previous professional life as a lawyer, whereby many would sadly confess that they felt that their world was falling apart as a consequence of the illicit actions of others. They would fear attending court sessions, with many having to enter the law courts building for the very first time in their life. It is also our obligation to work together even at different levels with NGOs, especially here in Malta, to protect victims' rights and to create a safe and non-judgmental environment which encourages victims of crime to tell their story. With the hope that these victims manage to take back control of their lives, get all the assistance required, and seek justice. All the stakeholders must be brought together so that they collectively will harness leverage and channel change to secure social comfort and support for victims and their families. The EU Victims' Rights Directive and the subsequent revision is a clear example of how resilient, sensitive, and empathetic we are expected to be yet simultaneously we're expected to be zero tolerant to abuse and in our strong fight against the perpetration of abuse and crime. With the same rationale in mind, we must take coordinated action at national level amongst all EU member states. Malta had enacted the Victims of Crime Act and initiated the principle of a one-stop shop mechanism through the establishment of the Victim Support Agency, as I mentioned before. Over the past year, many victims of crime in Malta made use of the VSE services. Some sought services for emotional support, where others were offered legal services, sometimes guidance, and some simply requested some information or another. Our agency is still at its infancy, but as I think we all agree, the potential is immeasurable, and we can observe its evolution every day in front of our own eyes when people come to us to seek help. As government, we are determined to spearhead this agenda and ensure that our agency serves its purpose. We must look ahead, and I think that we should be bold. The effectiveness of our resilience shall be measured by the level of ambition and consistency of all of us. You are all experts in this field. You have personally witnessed the experience of women, men, and children who are or were desperate, afraid, shattered, and with your work, you changed their lives for the better. Now this experience must be extended and amplified at policy level as well. And you can make a difference because the best policies emanate from human experience, just the one I had the privilege to hear today. This is why our commitment and presence here today is crucial for a better quality of life to victims of crime. Finally, I would like to thank Victim Support Europe, Victim Support Agency, and Victim Support Malta for the organization of today's conference here in Malta. It was a pleasure to meet some of you. I had the pleasure to meet and discuss before this conference. Unfortunately, I have other commitments and cannot stay for the full session, but I would like to congratulate you once again, and in Maltese we say il-hidma tayba. It means a good working day, and I hope you have the privilege to achieve that here today. Thank you all, and good day.
Thank you, Minister. I appreciate you need to leave. Okay, guys, so we're running a little bit behind time, so we'll try and make that up throughout the day. We now are moving into the plenary session of this morning's event, and the next range of speakers are experts in the different areas, so we're exploring the issue of resilience in lots of different circumstances. So our next speaker is joining us online. And that is Simon Green, who is Professor of Criminology and Victimology and the Associate Dean for Research and Enterprise, really long title, at the University of Hull in the UK. Just so you know, we're not doing big introductions in terms of biographies. Everybody's bios are online, so you want to find out a bit more about all of the wonderful speakers we have, go on to our website. So I'll now hand over to Simon Green.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Excellent. Always worth checking at moments like this. So it's great to be here. Thank you for the words from the Minister. I thought were fascinating, and to colleagues from the Commission, to Katarzyna, and in particular to Colm, who provided, I think, a profound and moving start to our proceedings today. I'm going to try and talk to you a bit about resilience. I feel that there's quite a lot I want to talk about. I'm not going to use any slides because I think it's another level of disconnect between all of you in Malta and me sat in my office in the dreary, rainy United Kingdom. But I have got some slides and I will attach them, just basic information, so you've got points of reference to the chat at the end. So I'm probably going to talk for about 15 minutes or so. And the first thing I want to say is I'm devastated not to be with you in Malta today. I had every intention of being there. My flights were booked. You may not be able to tell this from my pasty English complexion, but half my family is actually Maltese. My grandmother is from Malta. She lived in Slima. She met my grandfather during the Second World War. He was a soldier. They got married in 1942. My mother was born in Zira a few years later, and for many years I've been back to visit family and spend time in Malta, which I have enormously fond memories and family connections. So I'm really sad to not be there. We can, as usual in the United Kingdom, blame the British government and Brexit for this basic passport disaster on my part. But that hopefully won't detract too much from what I want to talk to you about today. I want to talk to you about resilience. One of my main areas is victim resilience, victim identity. The title of the presentation is Resilience Actor Mapping, Identifying Relevant Stakeholders for Engagement. It's a perfectly reasonable title, but I don't think I'm going to talk too much about relevant stakeholders, particularly to an audience of experts such as yourself. You probably know who most of the stakeholders are. What I want to talk to you more about, what is resilience and what are the qualities of resilience that perhaps we need to explore in terms of whether we refer to victims, survivors, or some other term, people with lived experience. So I've heard resilience referred to several times already this morning, and I agree with some of them, some of the ways in which it's used, and less with others, and that perhaps is irrelevant. But the most important thing, I think, is being used in different ways to describe different things and in different contexts. And once upon a time, I wrote a book about how the concept of community was used in similarly different ways for different contexts with different purposes. And I think I'm going to start by exercising a slight note of caution, which is there is an insidious or invidious side of resilience. It's a side of resilience which is just told to people to cope, to get on with it, to make do, to stop complaining. These are not helpful renditions of the word resilience when we think about the victims of interpersonal crime or indeed political violence. We, of course, here are all interested in how do we support the victims of crime? How do we enable them to find their own resilience? How do we empower people to find their own resilience? But we must be mindful that there is this other side to resilience. So I'm going to start very briefly with what is resilience and what it isn't. So at the moment, my own research is now starting to dovetail a bit with disaster resilience or flood resilience. And it's very clear to me that the concept of resilience is used very, very differently in this sphere. It has a different meaning and a different set of connotations when we think about the victims of environmental disaster. So I think what I'm going to do is just start briefly with what I don't think resilience is for crime victims. I have no problem at all with resilience being used differently in different contexts, but I think we need to be very careful that we don't confuse meaning. So as you'd expect from an academic, I'm going to start with the definitional question, which, to be fair, I was asked to do. So firstly, what resilience isn't? It isn't risk management, not for crime victims. But that, again, it slips into that tendency to think that victims are responsible for their own resilience, for avoiding their own victimization. And that, I think, is a dangerous route to take. It's not about risk avoidance, management, or indeed, particularly about vulnerability, which again implies all sorts of risk management approaches. Secondly, I don't think it's about personal responsibility. It's not about community responsibility or societal responsibility to prevent victimization. We do have that responsibility, but that is not what resilience is about, and we must be careful not to conflate them. Thirdly, I don't think resilience is about recovery, and I'm sure some of you may feel differently, but recovery in terms of definition is about returning to a previous state. And people who have experienced horrible, life-altering forms of victimization, violence, and injury don't go back. That's not where resilience comes from. It's not a return to a previous state. It's moving forward to a different place. So resilience is not about bounce back better. And I've heard that phrase both in victimology and more generally for the victims of crime. It's not about bounce back to better. It's not about how we tolerate austerity or manage impoverished communities. It's not about essentially organizational, socioeconomic, or community participation. All of those things are hugely important, but they don't conjure the essence of what resilience is. I think that's all we have to be thinking about across the next 2 days. And this is because criminal victimization is interpersonal and it is deliberate. People are harmed on purpose it is an injustice, not an accidental or environmental catastrophe, despite the man-made kind of aspects of that, person-made aspects of that. It's an injury to the individual and or theft of their property. Doesn't map well onto some of those other aspects of disaster management and resilience, therefore. And it's more than resistance, risk, or survival, as our colleagues in the UK, Sandra Walker and others have discussed in their excavation of resilience. Those things are important, but they don't really capture the essence. So I'm going to now try and talk briefly about what I think the essence of resilience is for crime victims. I think rather than bounce back better, it's bounce back different, or maybe just become different. It's about change, both internally and externally, about the self-identity and the social identity. We've often, a common phrase in the UK or in English, which I'm guessing may be familiar, is whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I'm not sure that really works here either. I think it's whatever doesn't kill you changes you profoundly. And resilience is found in that change and how it's understood. And it's personal. And it is not about the referral or support mechanisms that any individual receives. It is something more quintessential in the essence of how people experience that support. And I'm going to try and draw on some of my own research and someone else's research to try and explain that in a little bit more detail. Apologies, a bee has just flown into my office. And it's just flown out again, that's a relief. So, bounce back different. Whatever doesn't kill you changes you. And I think that's the fundamental here. So I'm going to draw now on a very recent book I've just had the pleasure of reading. The book is here. It is called Victims of Political Violence and Terrorism, Making Up Resilient Survivors by Will McGowan. I shall hold it up. You probably can't see it because the back screen, but there it is. Can I get on the screen? Never mind, I've got a reference in the slides, I'll point you to it. It's only just published by Routledge as part of their Victims, Culture and Society new book series. Really interesting, looks at first-hand interviews with the victims of political violence and terrorism to try and understand how they make sense of resilience. And there's a fantastic chapter or two that really helps explain and explore some of those dynamics from the perspective of people who've lived with political violence. So McGowan argues, I'm going to summarize, and this is a summary of obviously a whole book. There are 5 aspects or processes, states of resilience. And I think Colm's presentation at the start of today's conference really resonates with some of these. And of course, it's a very similar sort of victimization in that sense. So perhaps unsurprising, but really important to revisit. So the 5 types of resilience McGowan points to are: 1, the reformulation of self or experience. And what that means is essentially, I am different, and this is how I make sense of who I am, and also how I make sense of the experience I have gone through. It doesn't happen quickly. It happens over often decades, certainly years, a reshaping of who you are and what, and through it, a retelling of what happened to you. And through that, you get some control back over the circumstances that were inflicted upon you. This is the first aspect of resilience. The second one is group solidarity. Group solidarity. And this is very much around family and community and friends. It's about the need for support, the need for understanding, the need for people who are going to provide you with that emotional comfort, support, understanding as you wrestle, as Colm very aptly described, with all the impacts upon your life, your welfare, your emotional well-being, and your physical well-being, of course. So group solidarity is hugely important. Similarly, tacit peer support, number 3. That's the support of others who've had similar experiences. McGowan found this to be really important in speaking to survivors or people with lived experience. That actually talking to other people who've had similar experiences, who can relate and understand at a fundamental emotional level, is really important, again, to developing resilience. So the group of your family, but also the wider group of people who have lived through something similar, massively significant in terms of helping people find their resilience, find their strength. Fourthly, transcending the past. So this one's perhaps slightly more focused on political violence and terrorism, but I think is probably translatable to other forms of criminal victimization. So transcending the past as the fourth category, if you like, of resilience, refers to not being drowned in the past. And in particular, being able to say, no, I don't want to be part of a victim campaign. No, I'm not searching for justice more generally. I just want to extricate or remove myself. I'm not denying the past or what happened to me or the importance of these campaigns, but for my own sense of well-being, I only have enough energy, enough time to think about my own well-being and not the well-being of everyone else. And for some people, that was a really important barrier, a form of resilience to protecting oneself. And I think I found that fascinating when reading about McGowan's study. And finally, it's almost the reverse of that. The fifth one, resisting injustice. So this is people who find purpose, fighting for peace, fighting for the safety of others, using their own experiences to improve the world, the understanding and the experiences of other people who've had similar experiences. These 5 things, McGowan argues, are different aspects of where people find strength, resilience and growth from. All of them contain a degree of change, and all of them a degree of support. And I found that to be those 5 things to be fascinating aspects of the resilience, where resilience is found. It isn't in a particular service or a particular support. Those things are needed and they're hugely important, but it's much more about your relationship to them and your relationship to yourself and the reformulation of your identity and your purpose and your place in life, how you make sense of that. So I think those are really interesting findings, and perhaps that's because they relate very closely to my own research in this area. My research in this area is not yet fully published, although I have got a couple of publications that relate to it, which look at a new model for researching victims, which we've called the Strength, Growth, Resilience Framework. So there is an article in the British Journal of Criminology that conceptually maps this, but our study with people with lived experience of serious physical and sexual violence is forthcoming. So I'm going to end by talking about that and give you some quotes from the people we spoke to. And again, I think the thing that I found particularly powerful about McGowan's study is based on first-hand discussions with crime victims. And I think ours is as well. And that's a really important part of what it seems Victim Support Europe is about, and also what good victimology, victimological research should be about. So we developed this Strength, Growth, Resilience framework using a narrative appreciative methodology, which I'll very briefly unpack. Narrative appreciative methodology combines the methods of desistance research, which asks the questions, how does someone become an ex-offender? And in one sense, we were started with the question, how is it possible to become an ex-victim? Not sure it is, but I'll come back to that. And the methods of appreciative inquiry, which is a change management, and therefore ties to that notion of resilience as change that I mentioned before. By bringing both these aspects together, our task has been to try and ask victims questions that don't assume everything is negative about what's happened to them, but don't suggest that it's entirely positive either. So we try to find an open-ended way of understanding how victims changed and what made a difference to them. So rather than ask questions about what happened to you, what services would you have liked, what went wrong with the provision of services, or how were you treated badly, which often has been the focus of victimological research. We ask questions like, do you remember a particular low point since you were harmed? What or who helped you get out of it? We ask questions, is there an important event that represents a real turning point in your experience of victimization? A third one might be, looking back at what you've been through, is there anything or anyone that you especially valued? And what formal or informal supports have helped you most? So we tried to frame questions as tell us what made a difference rather than tell us what was awful. In doing so, we spoke to a fairly small group of victims or survivors. They had problems with both words, actually, and I still don't know what the right phrase to use is. But we spoke to a fairly small group of people who had been victims of very serious historic sexual and physical violence, some of it tied to conflict situations, most of it in the conventional domestic sense of criminal victimization. And they told us an awful lot about their experiences. And I think it resonates with some of the comments that have been made earlier today. So I'm going to try and pick out a few quotes, which I'm going to link to a couple of themes, which hopefully opens up something not positive, but something affirmative about how victims experienced the journey through what happened to them and what made a difference. So the first thing I'm going to point to is retelling. By asking for people to tell us about their experiences, the way they retold their stories of what happened was hugely powerful and hugely meaningful in their lives. And in particular, one of the things we found is how they told us about their experiences before victimization, their family life, their growing up, and what made a difference to them. And some of them had a very difficult lives growing up. So, for example, Lisa, one of our participants, obviously these are all pseudonyms and not the real names, told us this. She says, around age 9 or 10, I went to drown myself and failed. But this became a real source of strength because I knew I could try again. And that was what enabled me to have another day. And that, in one sense, is entirely counterintuitive, but it tells you something about how she fought through day after experiencing awful victimization. And Amanda, another person we spoke to, said, I come from super survivors and it must be in my blood. So the narrative people write about their backgrounds, both the very traumatic backgrounds they've come from and the more positive ones, that was really powerful in terms of how people described their victimization. And it also related to how they related to that title of victim, survivor, or something else. And in terms of retelling, people adapted, overcome, or rejected that label. And no one really said whether they preferred victim or survivor, maybe a slight preference for survivor. So, for example, Sarah, one of our participants, said, when I say I'm a victim, I feel like people will see that I'm a victim or feel sorry for me or feel something. So I said, no, not that. I'm still here. I can do myself. I can survive, not a survivor in that term, but I'm doing life my way. And that's part of resilience. It's doing it the way that works for you. And it's not just accepting the labels, titles, or position others put you in. And we really found that in our research. At the point at which people start to gather their sense of, no, this is what I want to be, that's the point at which they start to feel a degree of strength about how they cope. And again, another of our participants, Lisa, says, I don't like this idea. There's a pre and a post, as in something that happened before victimization and something that happens after it. That doesn't work for me. So that's why neither of these labels, victim or survivor, really work for me. They don't describe who she feels she is. So she rejects them. And that retelling, that reclaiming of identity is vastly important. So those are the retelling of the stories, family narrative, and relationship to labels, really important. Another thing we found was rituals. There's a lot of R-related words in here, which I was trying to create as a motif with some alliteration. So we found that there are two types of rituals that people found hugely helpful. And I think Colm talked a bit about this in terms of keeping a diary and writing and so forth. There are everyday rituals and there are profound moments of transformation, sort of Damascus moments when people fall off their horses and have a moment, an epiphany, a moment of awakening. But actually, one of the things that we were told by nearly everyone we spoke to was that they valued writing, they valued dance, they valued exercise, they valued the cup of tea in the morning, looking out across the hills. Whatever it might be, everyone had their rituals, which took them out of themselves. So, as Felicity says, so I wrote, I'm a poet. I wrote 3 books of poetry in 8 months. I sat by the fire for 5 months, listening to spiritual talks, listening to the threads of women, and trying to really no longer feel that I did something wrong. Fascinating points of reference. And Mark, another of our participants, said, cold water is good, always, because it gets you back into your body, out of your head and into your body. And these are the kinds of everyday rituals that people used to help them manage. I think that's really powerful. I think sometimes we're also geared to think, what support or service must we provide? How do we help? What rights should people have? There's a formalization of victim needs in terms of the delivery of justice. But actually, resilience is often invested in these much more mundane, everyday activities where people find their strength, or at least the ability to continue. On a more profound level of experience, some types of ritual are life-changing. So here's a quote from Lisa. Lisa's learning to drive.
Mr. Green?
Yeah.
Apologies for interrupting you. You have 1 minute left, if you can.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you very much.
No problem at all. I'll use this last quote, which is from Lisa, who's learning to drive. It does have a swear word in it, so apologies in advance. So Lisa says, my driving instructor was like, pull over, babe. Come on, pull over. So I pulled over and he said, you've got to understand something. You've got a fucking right to be on the fucking road. And it completely changed me because it was like a metaphor. I had no right to be on the road. I had no right to be in the world. And in these kinds of moments are transformative and help people out of the blue sometimes find different ways of locating their strength, their sense of who they are. And we found other things in terms of recognizing the importance of persons over processes and reclaiming power, purpose, and control. More conventional things, perhaps. But what I wanted to communicate was the importance of thinking about resilience in the context of the internal and external transformation and change that is vested just as much in people's own experiences and strategies as it is in the support services and stakeholders that we all work so hard to provide as well. And that's where I will stop. I'll put the link into, or the slides into the chat in a second. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. And we appreciate your efforts to join us here today. Unfortunately, hopefully the passport will be sorted for the next holiday anyway. But you're very informative session actually, and I think everyone will be wanting to see those slides. I know I certainly was scribbling away, so thank you. It's now time to hand over to our next speaker, who is joining us live here today, and that is Dr. Dora Georgiou from the University of Cyprus and the Netherlands, and the Institute for the Study of Crime and Law Enforcement. Welcome, Dora.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for your wonderful work and your passion around victim support. I'm a researcher and a practitioner. My research is mostly in reparations, this intervention called reparations, and what does it do for people? I'd like to connect this idea of reparations with resilience for you today. So as a contemporary society, we have currently developed all the necessary technological, epistemological, and practical means to satisfy the basic material needs of all people. Yet, we are not doing this on a global level. Instead, material gains are distributed unevenly so that historical inequalities are reproduced. Thus, we are currently living in an age where we know as a society that we can attend to inequalities around basic human needs that promote exploitation and victimization. But at the same time, we also are aware that this is not happening. This creates a sense of urgency and even an emotional state in all of us, like frustration and anger. From this juxtaposition, if we have the means and we're not doing it, if we are not building adaptive social ecologies for people, groups, organizations, and communities now, when will we ever do this? Satisfying basic needs may promote the satisfaction of further needs of self-actualization, of belonging, of love, of esteem, of achieving one's potential as a human being. And satisfying basic needs may eliminate dependence and vulnerability in relation to material needs that put people at risk for exploitation and victimization. But satisfying basic material needs alone will not ensure psychological or self-fulfillment and does not guarantee protection against victimization. The architecture of social situations is important, as social contexts can be structured in ways that encourage or inhibit the emergence of resilience, fostering thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So what does identity have to do with it? And we heard some speakers previously also highlight identity processes. And I will talk a little bit about individual and social identity now. As an academic, I also like to define a few things in the beginning. So although we are social animals, the individual experiences themselves as an individual. Therefore, the individual is a very important unit of agency. The individual has a physical body, and this body stops where another body begins, providing a sense of physical integrity. That is, I exist as a person. Regardless, the individual is formed and constrained within historic social contexts, so that the individual experiences themselves as a group member constantly and implicitly, and is aware of cultural and social hierarchical representations in relation to their group. So the I is nested within the we. From a social psychological point of view, we have four levels of analysis. We measure the intra-individual, what an individual feels inside of themselves, the interpersonal, what happens between two people, the intergroup, how groups relate to each other, and even as an individual, you might be relating to another person, but relating to them from the position of your group. And then you have the ideological, the wider level of social representations. So it's an ambitious agenda, and we can't always measure these things, but we try to take into account all levels of analysis. Social identity, research around social identity tells us that intergroup relations are important for how we define ourselves. Social identity emphasizes that belonging to groups is a central part of identity, along with personal identity, self-identity, and a universal identity, the human identity. So how we understand ourselves as a person has to do with the groups we belong to. Research shows that people tend to favor those categorized as in-group members and feel more positive towards those people. Research shows we gain self-esteem from the groups that we belong to, and that belonging is an intrinsic motivation to affiliate with others and be socially accepted. So very quickly, if we can move on to the next slide. So here, there are two women interacting, Amy and Beth. When they're in their interpersonal interaction, they are aware that they're women. But as soon as two men show up on the scene, this social identity of being a female becomes more salient, becomes more real. So social identity processes are fluid. They change according to different contexts, according to where we are, different people, according to how we feel. Research shows that we tend to categorize ourselves into groups, and we understand ourselves in terms of the qualities that our group has. So I am a member of Group A, for example, of this victim group. People in this victim group are survivors or are people who try and cope or many things, and then I look at myself as having those qualities as well. This is one way I understand myself as a human being. So we have in-groups, the groups we belong to, and out-groups, the groups that we do not belong to. So the formation of social identity impacts resilience because perceptions of victimization, victimhood, survivorship, redress, reparations, justice, all of these notions are filtered through the positional and ideological lens, as well as the interpersonal and intrapersonal. Resilience is both related to the individual and the social. Resilience does not imply the individual has some quintessential property inside of themselves that allows them to withstand being violated. No one withstands being violated. This is against the human condition, but individuals do find ways to recover, but beyond recovery, to heal and grow and transform, turning adversity into advantage. And this is a definition of individual resilience given by these researchers here. Now let's turn to social resilience. The development and expression of individual resilience is modulated through social resilience, which is the capacity of groups to foster, engage in, and sustain positive social relationships and to endure and recover from stressors and isolation. social resilience leads to growth through enhancing relationships, meaning-making, social engagement, and coordinated social responses to challenging situations. So the concept of social resilience highlights the key contribution to human welfare of coordinated social activity and feelings of connectedness. So now let's talk about reparations. What is the relationship between reparations and social resilience? And why am I focusing on reparations? Reparations is the focus of my research. I'm currently involved in 2 research projects that measure reparations. The one project that I will discuss with you today and give you some results about is reparations for victims of gross human rights violations in Cyprus, based on a decision by the European Court of Human Rights that involves only monetary compensation and no other forms of support, and has never been delivered. And the court decision was that Turkey should pay reparations to these victims. And currently I'm involved in another project that measures reparations for victims of sexual violence in Chechens and Russians, Tamils and Sinhalese in Sri Lanka, Turks and Kurds, and hopefully with the conflict we have right now in Russia and Ukraine will not enter the intractable phase. However, there is a history here that may ensure that it does. So this type of long-lasting, severe and violent conflict has serious implications for societies and for all of us around the world. So I just want to move on, because I don't have a lot of time, to the methods we use to research this and some of the quotes from our participants. So we do use a narrative method. This is if you can move forward a little bit to the lifeline. Here. So we ask participants and we map out their life in this sense. We ask them to begin with important events in their life from when they were a child and moving on to all their life, rather than ask them, what was the bad thing that happened to you and how do you feel about that? And then we do have some questions in a semi-structured interview about their experiences, but we want to honor the person as a lot more than that without downplaying their victimization as well. Another way we can do this is through a method we call photo elicitation, where we ask people to go out and take pictures of hopes and challenges in their life. So we don't try and define their victimization as, from our point of view, the milestone. We want them to tell us. And also we combine this method with quantitative tools that are used in the literature, in science, around the world, and have been accepted for their reliability. So in Cyprus, we have Cyprus, it's the last divided country in the European Union. The capital is divided. Greek Cypriots live down here. Turkish Cypriots live up there. We have no contact between us. We have different languages, different educational systems, different governments. Only the government here is recognized. The government here is a self-declared government. International law does not recognize. This conflict is known as the Cyprus problem, but there are basic things that we don't agree on either, like what's the percentage of the population Turkish Cypriot or Greek Cypriot? We don't agree on why this conflict came to be. Greek Cypriots will tell you Turkey invaded and occupied in 1974. Turkish Cypriots will say Turkey did a peacekeeping mission to help them not be under the Greek junta at the time. It's a complicated history. We had no contact between ourselves until 2003, so for 30 years we lived on the same island with no contact at all. And even now, where some checkpoints opened, we don't cross over, because if you cross over, you're a traitor. However, in this little island, half of the people lost housing, land, and property. Again, there's basic disagreement over who lost more. There's, as I mentioned, competing narratives and a colonial past that complicates things even further. Categories of social identity in Cyprus are very salient. The boundaries between in-groups and out-groups are impacted by the dominant political agendas. And the initial victimization has led to 50, 60 years of victimhood, depending on who you ask, and a severe lack of trust towards the state. So both sides share this in common, a severe lack of trust towards politicians and the state. So how can we create a common social identity? How can we cross the boundaries and with our peers, Turkish Cypriots, who have the same problems as Greek Cypriots, missing persons, being women who were raped, but this was never addressed in the Cyprus context. Both sides claim they lost more, and both sides, in a way, need the victimization to happen so they can claim to be ethically right. So they can avoid responsibility for the past. In Cyprus, we are living in the past. So I will give you a few quotes, if we can move on quickly, from our people in our sample. One person said, "The victim is one who is deprived of their property, their loved ones, whether they are the people they grew up with or are friends, and you are not given the capacity to solve the deprivation problem yourself." So here is talking about a lack in social agency. The government says, you just live with it. You got to get over it. Find a way to live. However, there are no means to do that. We as Turkish Cypriots became victims. For example, my husband was displaced in 1955 many times, but Greek Cypriots only tell the events after 1974, which was when the war occurred or when Turkey invaded Cyprus and is illegally occupying the island up until today. But Greek Cypriots only tell the events from 1974. But the majority of our people are victims from before. And that's true. Greek Cypriots, I'm a Greek Cypriot, we start the narrative from when the victimization occurred to our group. So this person is perceiving a lack of empathy for their group, a lack of connectedness with their counterparts, Greek Cypriots. And all in all, everyone had the same victimizing experience. Everyone lost housing, land, and property. People still have missing relatives that they don't know where they are. People are enclaved and cannot cross over. Various interviewees at both sides made claims about the absence of structural attempts by the government to facilitate justice and that they feel used by the government. And this resonates with something Colm said earlier, to be a bystander of your own victimization somehow, to feel that your victimization is not about you. Someone said the related states should change their attitudes towards victims, as the state expects the support of victims and asks for their votes. If the victims are known as A, B, C, the state should think that what it should provide for them. Such things should be arranged for the community so that they are not associated with politics. Okay, I know I'm going to have to finish. So I'll just choose an excerpt I want to tell you. So one person decided to get compensation for their property, and they were afraid to tell their fellow victims in their victim group for fear that their victimization will be undermined. So if you found a solution to your difficulty, then you are no longer one of us. And this was one reason a lot of people did not seek compensation, so they would not be rejected from their group. So all in all, reparations may actually be perceived as unjust when they are inadequate and or received under duress, such as financial need. Rather than actual belief in or desire for reparations, some people just accept it. It's what they have to do in dire straits. The use of international courts in Cyprus, the European Court of Human Rights, is used in tit-for-tat politics. So Greek Cypriots will take Turkey to the European Court of Human Rights to make a political point, And then the same will happen from the other side. These reparations were never awarded, and actually the victims who are beneficiaries of reparations under this European court ruling did not even know they were beneficiaries. The state took the case on their behalf without informing them. So, very quickly, I will say that social identity is important when we are trying to build up resilience, the connectedness people have, the peer support, the structures in society are very important. The potential for the construction of a common victimhood narrative exists in Cyprus, and some Cypriots have achieved this. Thank you. I'm making it. What? Okay. Very quickly, I will say that reparations are important, monetary compensation is important. However, what's important is to contextualize that, looking at the conflict at hand, talking to the victims, and that's the way forward. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dora. Okay, guys, I know we're running a bit late. We've one last plenary speaker before we break for coffee, which I'm sure is much needed. Two more? Oh, we've one online first. Sorry, we've two more before we go. Oh yes, we've Ash. So I'm moving across to Ash, who is joining us online and I think is ready to go. So I will hand straight over to Ash.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I just want to start by saying how very pleased I am to be with you. I know virtually at the moment, but thank you once again for the opportunity to share my experience and some of our work. I would like to share my screen here. 1 second, please. All right, here we go. So I'm gonna start by sharing my story with you, if I may, please. And so this is where my story starts. And so I have Dr. Pachori and Dr. Pachori here, my mom and dad. And in the interest of time, I shall talk about one Dr. Pachori today, and that is my dad, who is my dad and my greatest buddy. And just a little bit about him. His name was Dr. Pachori. He led the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as chairman for 13 years, and prior to that as vice chairman for 5 years. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the lead body that reviews the science and on climate change, and also provides synthesis and policy recommendations to global governments to take action on this particular issue, which is definitely one of the most pressing issues of our time, and certainly an existential threat. And science very clearly indicates that. So my dad became a climate crusader. His role at the IPCC certainly played a very important part in allowing him to amplify his voice. And in the year 2007, on behalf of the IPCC, he accepted the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, and this was shared between the IPCC and former Vice President Al Gore. I want to say that in the build-up to the year 2007, there was a lot of work that the IPCC did. Really, his work in terms of propelling attention to this issue and strengthening advocacy for climate action was one of the key reasons this issue was brought to the four and the Nobel Secretariat recognized their work, but also subsequent to 2007, because of the attention that was drawn to this issue, he was able to propel a lot more work on and attention to climate action. And I also want to say that this played a very important role in creating a whole other counter movement where vested interests and strong lobbies, which continue to exist, worked around the clock to prevent climate action. And I know a very conservative estimate in terms of budgets is that approximately $200 million US dollars were spent, continue to be spent, much more than that, to control and to block action on climate policy and climate change. And in fact, several of these very powerful lobbies ran 24-hour round-the-clock Patori desks, which worked very hard to discredit the science and also the messenger. And sadly, this is a reality. We know that in the case of even with the issue of tobacco, the tobacco industry, there have been very powerful lobbies that in fact continued for a very long time to dispute the science and any indication that smoking kills. And I just want to say, I know this is not very clear, but just to give you a snapshot view of the many sources that are funding this counter movement. And yes, certainly the fossil fuel industry is a very powerful one in making this happen. And this has also been documented extensively, the fact that particularly as Dr. Patori led the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, there's, the media covered this extensively because there was a tremendous effort to discredit climate science and also to minimize the messages that he shared, and he was very vocal. So I just want to give an example here of George Muambio, who's a well-known environmental journalist reporting for the Guardian at that point, talked about the smears, and also just to read out one line, he says, Patori is on the ropes, but he ain't down yet. The view is that it will take one more killer blow to fell him. And so, there were continuous attacks, and I just want to give you a quick view of some of them. Here's one, image here with, Donna from Canada, who continued to write very prolifically against all science and climate change, and particularly Dr. Patori. And so I just want to say that he was very much a victim of vested interests. However, I want to say that as he concluded his work with the IPCC, he was absolutely convinced that it was going to take action led by the youth of the world, the 1.8 billion young people in the world, who for various reasons he was convinced would be very important stakeholders at the forefront of the climate movement. And this is one, definitely that young people most certainly will bear the brunt of the impacts of climate change. Two, young people are not set in their ways, or can be influenced, and particularly influenced by the science of climate change, and therefore education will play an important part. And then finally, it will take all of us coming together. I know that there was mention of the fact that we need to act together like a family, and therefore also young people will play a key part in terms of influencing the parents at home and grandparents, teachers in schools, communities, neighbors, friends, parents, and so on. And so in order to be able to really get all stakeholders involved, young people would need to be at center. And like I said, the science of climate change would be a critical impetus in spearheading a movement. And therefore, with the POP movement, which was set up by my dad, where POP stands for Protect Our Planet, we have a tagline which reads, "Youth inspired by knowledge," and therefore the science of climate change should be the fundamental basis for all informed action. And certainly the POP movement focuses on SDG number 13, which is focusing on urgent action to tackle climate change and its most severe impacts. What I want to say, maybe a little bit of the obvious, but certainly climate change does not treat us all equally. And I know that this has been alluded to by speakers before me, so I won't get into it too much, but we know that the most vulnerable are the ones that will bear the brunt of this, of climate change more severely than anybody else, and certainly most vulnerable communities and marginalized communities. And therefore, a very important part of the work that the POP movement does really is, and I underscore, is inclusion, and really about bringing all communities to the movement. And I want to say, just really to touch on this, that we are still reeling from the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's still a surge of infection in various parts of the world, but I also want to say that climate change will bring with it an increased risk of pandemics and impacts on health. But also, very importantly, even before the pandemic happened, none of us were prepared in 2020 that this was, even though we'd heard about COVID. But I want to say that for a long time, even before COVID, there are a number of pandemics playing out simultaneously. And these certainly have been exacerbated by COVID. More recently, developments with conflict in Europe with the war, and then each one sort of compounds the other. So I just want to say, with climate change, we just make ourselves that much more vulnerable to each of these parallel pandemics, which includes domestic violence, hunger, most certainly, food insecurity, economic insecurity, which of course it relates to joblessness, and social unrest. So some of the questions we get asked is, how do you deal with the issue? How do you go out and talk to young people about climate change when they're in the midst of war? But I just want to say that we are definitely more vulnerable to increased conflict and war unless we tackle this issue. And one of the very fundamental aspects of the work of the POP movement is that we still have a window of opportunity. So it's really important that we act, and we act now. I'm just going to quickly brush through this, but I want to say also that we already have a surge of climate refugees. And as a consequence of conflict, of course, we have many more displaced communities. And sadly, with the way things are going in terms of even beginning to find practical solutions to this issue, we will have more and more displacement and climate refugees, estimated to be approximately 200, pardon me, sorry. Sorry for that. Sorry about that, yeah. So this is definitely an issue that will continue to create greater vulnerabilities. And just to bring up this point, which is about substance abuse, and the fact that we know even through the pandemic has created increasing cases of substance abuse and mental health. And it would be surprising, but for some, to learn that actually women are more likely to turn to substance abuse in situations of displacement and resulting in depression and anxiety, and so that just further compounds the issue. And then of course there's the infodemic, where we have a lot of misinformation, and clearly there's a movement to counter science and any credible information and people who share that information. So finally, one more important point, which is that WHO has recently, well, not recently, a couple of years ago, declared climate change as a public health emergency. And a report of April 2022 says that 99% of the world's population is breathing substandard air quality. So just to sum this up, I just want to say we'll have increased humanitarian crises, violation of rights, and certainly health crises as well. And of course, with the most vulnerable and marginalized communities, we have increased compounded stigma. And just to give you an example of one of the communities we're working with, a lady whose husband turned to substance abuse because he lost his job, then picked her up and put her on a highway. So is for her in the middle of the night. So is for her to bring money home to feed his drinking habit. And ultimately, she was raped 13 times. She's now an HIV positive sex worker, and you can imagine the tears and tears and tears of stigma. And this is increasingly a phenomenon we observe. But again, I'm going to go back to the important point, which is that we know
Mr.
that the science
Bachari,
very clearly.
Sorry to interrupt you. You have 5 minutes left. Thank you.
Yes. I just want to say that we know that the science very clearly indicates that we have a window of opportunity and that the time to take action is now. And to provide a perspective, and I'm building on some of the points that some of the previous speakers have already shared, I think is very, very important for us to appreciate that if you think back historically on moments which have changed the course of history, it's been about people coming together. They used to, for example, if you think about the freedom movements, got together to tell their stories, used music and dance to collect around a fire and amplify their voices. I just want to say it isn't about giving anybody voice, but it's about creating spaces and opportunities for people to amplify their voices. And I really believe that is the course to creating resilient communities, using participatory approaches that go inside out, and certainly to regenerative practices. So the important thing is that people have the ability to be active players, and solidarity and collective action being key. And this involves having inclusive approaches. And I just want to say at the POP movement, this is something we believe in and practice every single day. And I want to say that the important thing is that we understand that we need a climate of change, really. That's what we need. And all of us have a role to play. And this will take all of us coming together. And I think it is about recognizing and being a global family. And really it is about coming together as that universal one. And I've just got a few things here, but I'm going to ask everybody in the room, anybody who's listening outside of the room, to please think about what we can do to make a difference, because this is an issue that belongs to all of us. And unless we come together using approaches that are founded on respect, empathy, mindfulness, and thoughtfulness as we do this, we'll just not progress. We'll never make progress unless we do that. And to share that one of the unknown among, the known among our unknowns is that as the world grapples with many unknowns, the one thing that is known is that the well-being and progress will require social bonding, collective action, and support. And as Einstein said, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking that we used when we created them. And I just want to say, so with going back to my story, so the blow has continued, challenging Dr. Bachori's financial integrity, scientific integrity, and his personal and moral integrity. And then the final blow came. I just want to say that, however, he continues because he's left us a legacy. And the pop movement continues to move ahead. And we are now in 125 countries, working with 423 partners and counting, and over 2 million young people from around the world. We have also been identified as one of the best climate projects. And we continue this, crusade to honor his legacy. And I'm just going to say one more time that it's going to take all of us coming together. So I'm going to request you to please check us out at thepopmovement.org. And I know we're not all on Zoom here, but I was going to say, if you can all think about what the one thing is that we can do to make a difference. And thank you for listening to my story. But I just want to say once again that it is going to take us coming together as a global family, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Ash. I think it's really important that we're connecting all of these dots. Sometimes we're so busy in the here and now that we don't do that planning. We've seen this with our work on counterterrorism, where counterterrorism is focused on responding to the terrorists, but we have to understand there's a victimization and a response to victimization agenda. And it's the same for climate change. It's the same for all of these multiple stresses, these instabilities. We have to be thinking about what we as organizations need to do and what are the impacts on victims, on our ability to cope, and what our governments need to do as well. Fortunately, we now have Peter Milan, who is the CEO of Transcendent Media Capital and Jet Group, and she'll be talking not about so much the dangers and the problems of climate change when it comes to victimization, but maybe some of those solutions through regenerative solutions. Over to you, Peter.
Do I use a clicker or do you do it for me? Okay. Hi everybody, I'm Peter Milan. Thanks for the nice and warm introduction. I have a lot of friends in this community. Some of you know me through my impact media work, but that's just a tiny little bit of our work. So I'm going to talk to you today about where the real business is at in our work. So I'm an accredited regenerative practitioner, as is the entire team in our company Jet Group, okay? And I'm going to talk to you about regenerative frameworks. And I hope to bring a nice synthesis together of all of the previous speakers, because I'm hearing elements in some of what everybody has said so far today. Am I pressing the right one? This guy? Oh yeah, there we go. So some conditions, and I'm bringing, what Lev just said about radicalisation is important, and I've been in that counter-terrorism space as well for a few years. So some conditions for radicalisation, transitions to criminal behaviour and increasing victimisation, I'm kind of looking at them parallel. So when we look at the self, this is not an exhaustive list by any measure, right? This is just a few things that we've found in our work, is that cultural homogenisation and cultural displacement impacting belonging and identity, economic displacement, lack of access to diversity education, and loss of meaning and a sense of purpose at a self level can contribute to the conditions that give rise to transitions to criminal behaviour radicalisation, right? And when we look at current frameworks, such as the 3N framework, it's largely focusing on the self that's being radicalised through needs, narratives and networks. So loss of significance, conditions that lead a person to feeling insignificant, extreme loss, humiliation, injustice, dishonour, shame and alienation. And that's a really important thing when we're looking particularly at victims of crime, is the alienation that some of those victims may feel by lack of support or lack of engagement with their community. Opportunity to gain significance is the opportunity that they see in this kind of narrative building around radicalisation. The narratives, the ideologies or beliefs of a group that provide a personal significance or a signifier, and also the networks that are purporting the ideology. But what some folks may not be aware of, and this is an image from the IDMC from 2020 is that more displacements happened globally due to climate-related disasters and to conflict. And this is external displacement and internal displacement. So when we're looking at these displacements, along with the physical displacement often comes cultural and economic displacement relating from factors such as like mass casualty events. Also some of the other factors that we found correlations are gentrification of urban centres, and also cookie cutter smart solutions, which some of the big four are circulating around. They've done an interesting, a smart city solution in Sweden, and now they want to import that exact same solution into part of Northern Africa. It makes no sense. So when we're looking at this work in terms of mass casualty events and effects on displacement, this is an example from Bangladesh. I'm a bit discombobulated because I think I didn't start at the beginning of my presentation. I think the first slide that came out was partway through, but we'll see, I can go back. Yeah, I didn't start at the beginning, so my clicker is going in the wrong direction. Can I see if I can get back? No? Yeah, there's a whole bunch of slides missing, not showing up. Anyway, I'll keep going and see if it can be sorted out. So anyway, after Cyclone Didier in Bangladesh, we saw intense amount of external displacement and internal displacement that demonstrated a rise of trafficking in affected districts, also turned to gang crime because of economic displacement and different types of things like this. This is not just a developing nation challenge. We saw similar types of displacements after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. Florida reported about 50,000 people fled to Florida from after the catastrophe, and you saw increase in victim reporting. So just so you know, I think by the hurricane happened in the September, October. By December, they still had about 25% of the population without electricity. And they had police force working incredible hours that they were not being compensated for because there wasn't the budget for it, but there was the need. And so they stopped work. And then they saw a significant increase in murder rates in the January and the February. And then, with reporting of non-violent related crimes, like non-violent crimes, that requires a reporting. I mean, murder is easy to measure, right, because you have a dead body. So even though the non-violent related crimes didn't necessarily increase compared to the January of the previous year, they think there was a significant amount of underreporting just because of the nature of the trauma and also the lack of availability of police during that period. So overall, there was a big increase. So we're going to get to working regeneratively. It's okay, I found my slides and I forgot that I'd reordered them. Okay, so why regeneration? So regenerative approach works at a deeper level than structures. And I'm going to explain this complicated sentence, and Lev's probably rolling his eyes and saying, I told her to be simple. But we're working with complex structures, so I'm going to try and break it down. So we're working on a deeper level than the structures. We work on the underlying systems so that social, ecological, and economic structures become more resilient to the impacts on those structures. So I'm going to give you an example of what I mean. Structure versus system. A structure is any organised whole, something that we can observe. And it gets a bit confusing because we use the word system in our language to describe structures, sometimes like an ecosystem. It's actually a structure. An object, a living being, a home, a community, a process, a government, they're all structures. So what are we talking about when we say system? What we're talking about is the underlying patterns and dynamics that make a structure what it is. So a metaphor is the wood wide web. I've got a picture here. So the structures are the root system, the trunk, the tree, and you mentioned nestedness, Dora. So the tree is nested into a larger context, which will be the forest, which is nested in a larger context, which might be Amazonia, which is then Latin America, and so the nestedness works. The system is the energetic or vibrational communication that happens between a tree. So in a forest system, you have to have a mother tree. And the mother tree communicates through this series of underground networks to the rest of the forest. And the mother tree is required for the growth and the thriving of the forest. If you cut down the mother tree, then you jeopardize the ability for the forest to regrow, or it takes many, many years to restore that. So when we're looking at these types of economic, social, and ecological structures that we're working with in our work, we go beneath the structures into the systems. And what I mean by that is, and Colm shared about this concept of a worldview, a sense of identity, the way in which we perceive and give meaning to things, the nature of the human dynamics that's very relational. And we work here, and Simon also mentioned this idea of essences, and so that's what we work with. But we work 3 lines of work simultaneously. And a big part of the challenge of why we can't get to systemic transformation, including around victims' issues, in my experience of being mentored by many of you in this room, is even the funding works in silos, right? We're in this kind of post-Cartesian era of trying to understand complex systems by breaking it down into its parts and pieces. But it's like the metaphor of the elephant. You can send a specialist out to understand a trunk. You can send a specialist out to understand a foot. You can understand an ear. But you don't get a sense of the elephant. You just end up with experts in these different areas, right? You don't get the essence of the elephant. And so we work with essences in that way, and if you're not working at essences that way, you bump into some of the challenges you've expressed, Dora, where you have different opinions and belief structures that are in conflict with each other, right? So how do you get communities to a place where they can identify, they can share something that unites them, that's powerful? So I'm using the example of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia because that's where we're currently about to do a big project. And it's interesting because, I don't know if you know, but the government is very interested in diversifying away from its historic commitments. So they're trying to diversify from oil and gas and grow tourism sector. They've developed a really inspiring 2030 strategy, actually, where they've identified pillars of dynamic society, and women and gender rights exist within that pillar. Business and economy, tourism and heritage, nature and environment. The challenge, however, is that they all remain siloed to those pillars. And they all have different levels, different experts working in those areas, different projects, different sources of funding, right? If we're not able to lift up those pillars and get to the systems underpinning the fabric of what gives rise to the society in the way that it is, we're not able to really understand these patterns and intersections that can create a powerful systemic shift. So after, I don't know if you guys have read up on the history of radical Islam and its exportation from Iran after the civil movement, and the current prince right now is trying to return to a more moderate Islam, right? And interestingly, he's spoken about, one method is to create interfaith dialogue and intra-Islamic tolerance. However, we know from the successful DRAD programs in the Nordics that when you're dealing with persons' fundamental needs, the first thing they drop is the ideology. It's not the ideology that's necessarily compelling, it's a sense of belonging, it's a sense of meaning and purpose, it's a sense of being able to contribute something of whatever their identity structures are at that time. And then disconnected to this is a counterterrorism approach, which is, to me, quite a standard counterterrorism approach based on what I've seen so far, which is the security forces, the men, financial controls to prevent the radicalization process, and DRAD, which is the mindset, shifting the mindset of those that are already radicalized. So what we're doing when we're working is we're working on the underlying conditions of an individual personal experience. And we're establishing a shared purpose in the community that exists as bigger than the self, right? And when individuals can find a defined role for themselves in that shared purpose. And this is actually what some of the good DRAG programs are doing, right? When they're helping to have people find sense of meaning and purpose in a community in a healthier way. We create what we call a collective vocation. So this is the course of people working together, developing a really powerful sense of purpose, which benefits the self, the community, and the larger ecosystems, including the natural systems, right? And this process isn't just civil society. We also include in this process policymakers, government leaders, law enforcement, private businesses, private sector, the NGOs. And we bring all of them together through a process of field work that we do. And then we also work with the communities on governance. And this is important because the concept of regeneration is about creating a self-renewing sense of thriving for all of life over time. And so what we do is we work to reduce the conditions that led to the degeneration of social, ecological and economic structures to rebuild in a way that brings reciprocal benefit along the lines of self, community, and the structures, right? We want to express the potential, the thriving potential of the system. So examples of some drivers that we've found are impacted are, we get to design evolutionary business models. Well, what does that mean? A lot of our business practices are extractive, right? They've led to a lot of the environmental degradation that we've seen. And we know that there is a direct correlation between environmental degradation and poverty, right? Regeneration of natural ecosystems. How do we actually rebuild and get those ecosystems renewing themselves over time, responsible for their own flourishing? Development of deepened understanding and tolerance of participants. Stewardship and governance, one of the most important things. These processes are created by the community. We're just there to support them with the regenerative frameworks through which they can start to perceive themselves, their world in a regenerative way, right? We don't come in as experts telling them what they need to do. Inclusion, purpose, shared values, and improved meeting of fundamental needs, and the establishment of new capabilities in the process. So the process is fundamentally developmental. And what we know is that in communities, victims already exist, even if they've never reported, even if they think that domestic violence is a natural part of being married. The work is fundamentally developmental. So what we found, and it ties into some of what Colm has said earlier, is that when you're developing yourself and building new capabilities, it requires you to develop yourself. And often what happens is that the development of self, it gives rise and space to the acknowledgement of traumas that have people feeling limited, right? The traumas start to come up, which includes victimization experiences that they may not have shared in the past. And so the regenerative work demands that the community actually create a shared and safe space and a shared capability to also work through victims' issues and trauma in a shared way. And that's where we also need victim support services to support in that process, right? But it becomes community driven. I'm sharing my hero, one of my heroes, Mary Fetchett, who's not here today. So for those of you who don't know her, she lost her son Brad in 9/11. She's the founder of Voices of 9/11. And she actually has been very powerful activating force in bringing policy and change for first responders and also victims of that particular attack. So what the process does is it allows for reintegration. So communities working, in this type of way, it allows for victims to reintegrate their experiences into a new sense of selfhood, and allows victims to channel that fresh sense of purpose, which often comes through that, into the community. And we see that with examples like Mary, who had her horrible grief and trauma, which words can't express, channeling her energy into something that was productive for her community. So many examples of that we see amongst human beings, but they happen kind of accidentally or as a result of an extreme pressure, force, or trauma, right? What regenerative work does is we programmatically unlock that energy that people have within themselves that's often latent to create change. And that happens at a, like I said, at a self level, a community level, and at a system level. So I don't have much time. I'm trying to stick to the 5-minute warning. But yeah, so that's some of the work that we're doing by applying these regenerative frameworks to try to get to some of the systemic changes. Part of the challenge is, you know, Colm said he's built some resilience for himself and he may be able to survive another trauma. But if we're putting folks back into degenerating systems or social systems, including ecologically, right? So the UN DDR came out with a report in 2020. They had done research with the Centre of Epidemiology in Brussels. There have been close to, in the past 20 years, 8,000 catastrophic climate events that have affected over 1 billion people globally, some more than once, and cost us 2.97 trillion in economic loss, and that is expected to get worse, right? We're already seeing it with this huge drought in India right now, 1 billion people affected. We're seeing it with flash floods, fires, all types of stuff. So we can't keep expecting people to be re-traumatized over and over again. So we're giving power to the community to define and shape their own narrative, build their own initiatives that's building resilience within themselves, but shaping their community, their society, their structures in a way that's inherently expressing their own uniqueness, their own unique essence of their place, their own unique potential. And I think that we have to build into potential rather than just be a crisis response. Because as rightly so Simon said, resilience is not just about bouncing back to pre-crisis conditions, right? And that way we have the agility to be continuously evolving and co-evolving with the uncertainty in our external world that we face in a way that can foster the thriving of life. So, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you to Peter. Thank you to all of our speakers. What we hope to achieve, I think, in this morning is giving some context to resilience, which we've not spoken about together, but also thinking about the different situations we're facing in the coming years. We heard about Colm, who really didn't have the support he needed for decades. When we're thinking about all of these different crises that may be coming up, we've got the Ukraine crisis now, how do we plan for and be prepared for all of those, and how do we put in place the systems now for those future crises? This is part of what we're looking at. Victim Support Europe filmed a 3D film. It's primarily for police training and others, but it was filmed in 3D using actors. It's of a sexual violence victim being interviewed by the police in not the most helpful of manners. If you're interested in seeing it using the full Oculus headset at some point in the next 2 days, Ruben at the back has the headset. We've done an edited version of 3 minutes. There he is, standing up. The other good-looking one. Why are you laughing, Carmen? So, if you're interested, then he's there. You can watch that video as well. And I think it's one of the ways in which we're trying to make training as immersive as possible. Which leads us on to Colm here, who has kindly agreed to moderate, and I'm absolutely certain he'll do a wonderful job of that, focusing a little bit on the digital methods for delivering services. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Colm, who will do the same as Andrea did earlier today. Thank you.
I'll steal this one, I think. Thank you, Livette. Good afternoon. I'm sure you thought that was the last time you'd see me this morning, so this is different, guys. I'm a university lecturer by day, so hence the reason why I offered my services to the fantastic Marina and Lissalette to monitor this particular session. It means a lot to me because what we did in what we're going to discuss in this session is the movement and how we have adapted our services, or your services, to be used online. And it's something that actually became really important to me during COVID because I was unable to access counselling and therapy face-to-face, but the Wave Trauma Centre in Oma had went online, and I was able to contact them and access their services, and it proved probably one of the most revolutionary times for me because I was really able to get help that was so important at a time for me. So I do want you to really concentrate on what the speakers have to say. I know digital applications may sound a little bit, tiring at this stage of the day, but I think it is the future for a lot of what you guys are doing and how we deliver services to those people that need it remotely and across a lot of different areas. I'm going to ask you to do one thing, and I know this morning we had a very lack of questions, I believe, and as a university lecturer, that's just something I can't abide by. But I ask you all just to do one thing, is that write down one question from everything that you hear. Each person will speak for 7 minutes and 7 minutes only, so they won't be running over. I'm very strict as well, which means we're going to have a lot of time for Q&A. But I want each of you just to take the time and write one question down. Even if you do not ask it, write it down, because even if you do not ask it, it means that you're thinking and that you're trying to take one thing away from what these great people are talking about that hopefully will help you when you go back into the office. And remember, it is people like me that really benefit from the work that goes on here today. So the patience and the time you take and the learnings you take from today and from this session are really very important to help other people like myself avail of services. So anyway, that's enough of the blackmail and the emotional blackmail. I apologize. But I think it is important that we do re-establish why we're here and what we're trying to achieve. So I've got three fantastic speakers. We have Christina. I can't. 2 seconds.
Sueiro, just Christina.
So we have Christina, we have Jerome Moreau, we have Rosa Jansen. All of them are much more qualified than I could ever imagine to be in any field. Each of them are going to speak about their experiences moving to online in different ways, both from a hybrid model and an organization and business continuity model, and also from the point of view of how they learned from things through COVID. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over. Christina is going to go first, and then Jerome, and then Rosa. I'll keep an eye on their timings, and then we'll open it up to the floor for some discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I don't have many time, so I'm very happy to be here, and I'd like to share our thinking and our experience about the way to receive to help victims in pandemic context. So we made a study or research. We have been funded by a Portuguese scientific research government. Sorry for my English, I'm a little bit nervous. So, and I'll share some data. So I can do it. Okay. Wow, what I have done. I always have problems with technology. I think I have bad vibrations. Okay, so thank you. So the first thing I'd like to show is what happened in the pandemic context, what happened with our support strategies. And as you can find, 82% of our professionals provide support during, for example, the lockdown, and 57% maintain the face-to-face support. And 60% of professionals were in teleworking, and the change after lockdown, a little bit changes, but what we can find that we have here a blending strategies to give support. And the most important thing is that our professionals maintain the support in hard conditions. So this is, we have made a survey with all our professional work in the victim support in Portugal. Then we decided to do this study. I don't have the time to explain, but we have two main concerns. The first concern, the first issue, is to understand the changes regarding the type of crimes that our victims had to have survived in the pandemic context. What we have changes or we don't have changes. And the second issue is to understand what the best way that we can improve the use of tools like to give support online, the remote support. And in the APAV, we have already a project regarding the use of this kind of tools. But always we look at to that as a second tool, not a big tool, but it's not. So the pandemic context showed that we can use a blend. I'm finished now, a little bit, to use a blend system, but we need to have in mind some preoccupation regarding the preparation of our own professionals, and also what kind of conditions have our victims to, for example, to do a video conference session with the professional. And if they know how to use it, and if they can use it because the offender is, for example, at home. So lots of questions can be have in mind regarding on that. But just to show a little bit, this is the comparison between 2019 and 2020 regarding the number of requests for help that APAV received. As you can see, we have a growth in general of 30% of the crimes in general, but we have a growth, an increase after the lockdown of people who came to our association and request for help by phone, mainly by phone, and second, face-to-face. So the use of the phone is the most important tool that the victims use in this situation. So another thing is the most part of the cases are about intimate partner violence. And as you can see, the post-lockdown also have an increase in all types of victims we receive in APAV, regarding children, adolescents, other family contexts, elderly, and mostly intimate partner violence. So this is our data. We have our institution have a national level, so we collect all the information at national level. So I don't have much time. So the type of support we provided was mainly emotional support and emotional and legal support by phone and face-to-face and then online. As you can see in that numbers, are a huge number of cases. A hard work our professional had during the pandemic and during all the time. And just to see, when we ask to our professionals what kind of use we can do about other tools than the face-to-face, they told us that the best was the phone, then video conference, and then email, for example. They show us this information. And then we also discuss about the benefits, obstacles, and risk of the remote support. And as you can see, the benefits identified by our own professionals helps to deal with isolation of the victims, reduce inhibition, fear, and shame, lower costs, empowerment of the victims. But also you can find some obstacles. Difficulty of assessing the use of digital technology by the victims. This is a reality. In our country, low knowledge of the use of digital technology by the victims. These are the most important obstacles. And risks. For the professionals, they don't identify any risks, but for the victims, yes, several types of risks. Depends on the context of the victim and the context of they live. And so the solution is, of course, blending support. And the blending support must have in mind some issues, and I'll put the final conclusion because it's more clear here. Digital and technological solutions are an important alternative and complement to face-to-face support, but we must provide training to support professionals in use of this kind of digital solutions. And also promote digital literacy among victims to minimize the risk of use of this kind of tools. And provide funding also to the institutions of supporting victims to have access to this kind of tools, because this is very expensive to have this kind of systems at national level. So our project was we have in mind to try to characterize the problem, the impact of pandemic, and we find it was a bad situation, but we looked some achievements with that, and one of them is to understand that we can do support at different levels using different kind of strategies, and this is, I think, is very important today. Thank you very much.
good, wasn't she? 16 seconds over. Fair play, eh? So one of the things, I suppose, as we move on, because these are really, really quick, is just think about some of the main points that are made by Christina with regards to the data collected by the Portuguese authorities is amazing in terms of that comparative analysis, which very few people and countries would have thought about the time, and their understanding of how to move hybrid because they have done that work. So I think there's huge amount of learnings from the experiences that you have already achieved, Christina. So thank you very much for sharing that. Next, I'd like to call up Jerome Moreau. Jerome, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Vice President of Victim Support Europe and France Victim, I'm very pleased to present the French system we have built to enable victims of a major crime or attack, or in a case where there are many people injured or directly involved, to cope better long term. I apologize for my accent and my bad English, but everybody knows I will learn English and foreign language in France, so be indulgent. In fact, for the last 40 years, France has been developing different policies to help and support victims. But resilience is a new objective for victim support services. All the structures today in France have to implement systems to improve resilience in victims. And this issue changes the level and the intensity of the support needed, and it is another way for us to recovery. I can affirm Victims France Association, France Victim, and the 130 local associations have worked a lot to influence our French government to promote a new vision to help and support victims in several areas, such as victims of terrorism, victims of climatic events, or aircraft crashes. Many events, in particular terrorist attacks in France, created a major change toward improving a vision of resilience and implementing really good treatment, because those terrorist attacks have had the same impact on the French as the Twin Tower attacks in New York had on the Americans. Now we have understood that in order to achieve resilience, we must deal with the issue immediately after the event. Firstly, in an emergency, we have built a new organization for resilience. First of all, at the beginning of the event, in an emergency, many resources are deployed to achieve better treatment for people and victims. In fact, the Minister of the Interior becomes the nerve center for handling emergency calls and support for victims and relatives in order to guarantee coherent and coordinated action with the various public institutions and private associations. They will work together to analyze the origin of the event, to cope with it, to organize the emergency services, to protect people and states, and deliver the first communication element in a structure, a sort of crisis and support center named today Info Service, in which there are representatives from the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Health, and the National Commissioner for Assistance to Victims. And France Victims will also participate. And then the helpline, the orientation of the relatives of the victims, and the announcement to family of the dead or injured become effective all in the same place. At the same time, and at the local level, the reception for Center for Families is immediately opened in an emergency situation, and the local victim assistance committees works over a long term and with broader competence. The interest lies in the coordination of the consequences of the event with the main ideas, to identify the data and the victims, to help the family, to communicate on the consequences of the event, to mobilize the legal team and in particular, if necessary, the Anti-Terrorist Prosecutor's Office, and finally, to find the victim support associations to help the victims. Now, many resources and services are made available to take care of victims from the very beginning. And we know the earlier the victims are helped and supported, the better and the sooner they can recover. Secondly, France built a trauma structure and a coordination in France. The most important innovation lies in the creation of the psychiatric and psychological support structure aiming at providing aid to victims. After the terrorist attacks in Paris, the French government trying to expose a new vision around the psychological path for victims, and he noted the fragmented nature of the services and the principle that many psychologists and public psychiatric services were helpless. It is really time for the age of resilience because the number of victims has continued to increase. In France, in fact, 9 fatal terrorist attacks have been committed and 37 terrorist acts have been perpetrated since the Charlie Hebdo murders in January 2015. So, for resilience, in fact, 2 systems were built. At a national level, with the National Resource and Resilience Center, and at a local level, the regional psychotrauma centers. The National Resource and Resilience Center is a multidisciplinary public department developed after the 2015 attack in France by the Ministry of Justice and by the Health Ministry. It was created with the aim of consolidating the state of knowledge in the field of psychological trauma and resilience and to improve the method of the psychological care. The National Resource and Resilience Project has been created by the contribution of people who have experienced the impact of psychotrauma. This national center is responsible for coordinating the 12 regional centers, which are the structure that will support victims toward resilience. The regional psychotrauma centers are intended to offer places of orientation or specialized consultation for people who are victims of psychotrauma, regardless of the nature of the trauma experience, physical or psychological, the result of an accident, violence, abuse, etc., and the population concerned, children, adults, civilians, soldiers, the disabled, migrants. The objective is to allow victims to be helped and supported in order to make them progress concerning their trauma, to ensure that they overcome the consequences of the offense, the crime, or the event. Currently, these centers are working on the trial of terrorist attack in Paris, the mourning, the influence of abusers over victims of domestic violence, refugees fleeing the war in Ukraine. There is a link between the network of France Victims and the psychotrauma centers. The local centers work around the trauma, and the Victim Support Association in the other issue, social, legal, compensation for victims. The last axis is the Victim Support Association in France. All the association will all the associative services, receptionists, lawyers, psychologists, and social workers. Resilience is possible because the association are working on these subjects and are trying to implement services toward resilience. Today, our psychologists have different methods and models for helping victims. Training is organized for all of them by the Federation. There is also a new vision by the social worker with the facility dog, recovery with animals, by the earth, for example. The aim is to achieve resilience for the victim. To conclude, I can say a new organization has been built in France and the age of resilience is coming for victims. Margaret Mead wrote, "Never doubt that a small group of thinking, committed citizens can change the world." In fact, it is the only way that this ever has happened. This is perhaps the message that I would like to promote during this wonderful symposium. As Mark Twain said, They didn't know it was impossible, so they did it. Thank you.
Okay, we won't talk about the timing for Jerome, but from what I've heard, that was pretty good for Jerome, you know, so that was excellent. Fantastic. What I want to think about, I mean, the key messages for what Jerome was talking about was that France had to go through a huge amount of terrorism, which is an awful thing for any country, before they had to realize the changes that need to be made at an organizational level across a vast geographic region to build up an organizational structure that would allow them to move forward. The question I ask for you is, within your own jurisdictions, do you have those in mind and set up already? And if they are, do you know your role? And if you do not, you should find out from Jerome the steps that they took, because that is key for us. Without the structures and the organizations in place, how do we react to the day when it becomes part of your jurisdiction to deal with that? And I think that unfortunately for France, it is something they've had to learn very quickly over the last years. And I think it's something that we need to learn from and replicate across lots of different jurisdictions. So thank you for Jerome. Last but not least, the wonderful Rosa, who I spent a lot of time last night talking to, which didn't make my wife at all pleased. But Rosa is from our friends in the Netherlands. So she is going to speak again from the point of view from a digital and a business improvement point of view of how we can actually take this forward. So please, Rosa.
It's on? It's on? Okay. I don't have to do anything. That's the way. I'm very glad to stand here. We are trained last night by Colm. That's the only thing he didn't tell you today, that we have to stay in between these 7 minutes. So that's why we are hurry up all the time. I have to talk with you about business continuity and crisis management in 7 minutes. So I think the crisis take more time than my explanation, but I do my best. I did a little bit of preparation because it's impossible to do that in 7 minutes. Maybe we can take that as a topic in another conference. So I prepared myself, and I like to introduce victim support the Netherlands in 19 seconds. I thought I can start with that at least. And I left the PowerPoint already aside, but it will be sent to you with all the information.
Het overkomt 1 op de 5 Nederlanders.
Subscribe.
Ze worden slachtoffer van bijvoorbeeld inbraak, misbruik, een verkeersongeluk of een calamiteit. Ingrijpende gebeurtenissen, soms met grote lichamelijke en emotionele gevolgen. Betrokkenen moeten vaak allerlei zaken regelen, terwijl ze volop bezig zijn met het verwerken van wat er gebeurd is. Komt het tot een rechtszaak, dan kan dit zomaar maanden of jaren duren. Voor zowel het slachtoffer als familie en vrienden is het een nieuwe situatie waar veel bij komt kijken. Of je nu slachtoffer bent of een slachtoffer ondersteunt, Slachtofferhulp Nederland is er om daarbij te helpen. Jaarlijks bieden wij kosteloos emotionele, praktische en juridische hulp aan honderdduizenden slachtoffers en hun naasten. In elke gemeente kunnen zij een beroep op ons doen. Dat kan online, telefonisch of persoonlijk. We staan slachtoffers bij en kunnen hen in contact brengen met lotgenoten, wat vaak helpt bij het herstel. We delen onze kennis over slachtofferschap en werken nauw samen met partners in de zorg- en strafrechtketen. Dat doen we met één doel voor ogen: recht en herstel voor slachtoffers, zodat zij de draad van het leven weer kunnen oppakken. Slachtofferhulp Nederland. Vandaag verder.
That's in fact, in a nutshell, the work we do. I think a lot of your organizations do exactly the same, but it's good to give an overview of it. What I want to tell you as an extra for today is what did COVID with our organization? as all of us, I think, we are not in the world for ourselves, but we are there to help victims. I think when I talk with all of you, I hear that that's the most important point. We are on Earth. So when COVID came and the door closed, and even the doors of the courts in Netherlands closed for a couple of months, so that was really disastrous for victims. We were sitting together and thought, how can we organize as quick as possible what victims needed in such a difficult situation. And in fact, what we did is we tried to build up all kind of practical things. For example, we made connections, online connections with all the courts, from our offices to all the courts, so that the victims, when the courts went open, could speak with in the courts from our offices. That was a very good system, and we hope we can use it in the future. There were all kinds of problems around it, but that's the first thing we did. And we also built a special, easy connection for a lot of people. I don't know how it was in your organization, but I think 2 years ago, a lot of people have never worked with Teams. I think we sit in it now if we do it every day, but a lot of people in my organization had no idea where the button was. So we started with, we have in our organization a lot of volunteers. So sometimes there are older people, but also younger people. So we developed a buddy system. So from one day to another, the young ones help the old ones. And in fact, in a couple of weeks, everyone was ready to do that. So I'm very proud of the organization that they want to jump into to this. And I think it has to do because our organization is a crisis organization. If you yell in our organization crisis, everyone, you don't have to explain everything. Everyone has the right coat and the right bag with them. And go where they have to go, you don't have to explain anything. And we used, in fact, the power of our organization to organize also COVID. Of course, it had some troubles in it, but we thought, because we had, in fact, COVID brought, it's strange to say, but it was not a nice time, but it brought a lot of good things for us. Because before the COVID period, we started a big reorganization. In fact, we introduced all kinds of online tools and platforms and whatever. And you know, like in a lot of organizations, not everyone likes that, and especially not in victim support organizations, because especially our volunteers came to me and tell me and said, Rosa, you have to talk with victims. You can't do anything online. That doesn't work. Services and help you should do face-to-face. And of course, if it's possible. But when it's not possible, you have to find other solutions. So this period of COVID made it necessary to go on with it. And we could speed up in a way you have never seen. When I should have promises 2 years ago to the government and to the victims, I shouldn't promise it because I was wondering if we could handle it. But in COVID time, it seemed to be that we could do everything. So in fact, it worked out very well. So what did we do? We had all this kind of practical thing, but aside of that, we have decided that we should make ourselves future-proof because we are talking about COVID, but we thought maybe after COVID there is something else. So in fact, our motto was agility is in fact the key for the future. So in all our services were of course face-to-face, but we thought we have to in fact, implement them also and develop them also in another way. So on this moment, we call our services hybrid. That means that we look to the victim is deciding how we want to reach us, and we built it in a way that they can do it face-to-face, but it's also possible to do it in another way. To give you an example, a lot of victims of sexual abuse don't want to come to us in the beginning. They want to be anonymous, and like to chat with us, and later on, they want to have contact with us. So it's a very nice way to work in a sort of hybrid way, but always the victim is in the lead. And in fact, we did it with all our services. And in 2 years' time, we could develop a lot of things. So to give you an idea, the young ones, they don't want to call. I don't know if it's the same in your country. They like to chat all the time. If you call them, no, not at all. But if you chat, they understand completely, and then you have a very good contact. So there's a good chat service. There is a good call service of call center, whatever. But for example, what we didn't expect what should work, we had a lot of peer group sessions, live peer group sessions, that peers meet each other who are victims of the same crimes. But we developed also online communities. And now we see that the online communities work better, even better than the live, the face-to-face communities. And sometimes they start online and later on they go on live to live. But it's a good way to start. And it's another way of working. You should never compare it. But you can offer a lot of people a lot of help. And that's in fact what we had in mind. I'm out of time, yes. But to give you an idea, I think 2 years ago we reached about 200,000 people, and on this moment we reach 1 million people. So it was growing very fast, and I'm not one who's promoting online all the time, but it's a way to connecting with people, and later on you can work it out. So I think it's a very important thing. May I say one thing about helpers? Yes, one last sentence. Another very important thing, because in fact I promised to Colm to tell you about that, what we developed, that is a platform for helpers and professional helpers. Because in the COVID time, we saw that it was very difficult to reach anyone. So we did a little research and we saw that a lot of people want to help victims. The platform word helpers work very well, because helpers, to give you a definition, these are your friends, your neighbors, and whatever, and they like to help, but they don't know what they can do and how far they can go. And what's the most important question we got is, can I stop? You know, I like to keep my friend. I don't want to be the helper all the time, but maybe I can do something. So this helpers platform worked out very well. So it's a platform, to give you an idea, where you can find all kinds of information, how to do little conversations, training, they can follow online, all kinds of tips and tricks. So it's all there for the helpers. So these are your neighbors, you're close by. And the other platform is the platform for professional helpers. And these are, in fact, the doctor, your nurse, someone in the hospital, whatever, who say they come to us, they have a lot of questions, but then we have to send them to you. Can we work together? So we see that it's COVID time, we have find all kinds of solutions to reach each other. And I think because there are thousands and thousands of victims, and that's, it's not nice to say it, but I hear it from you, and it's in my country too. But for us it's very important that no victims should stand alone. So we find ways to reach them all. And it's impossible, I think, I don't know how it is in your country, to find budget for the last victim. So I think you have to be as smart, as creative as possible. And that's in fact what we try to develop in this COVID time. And it's part of a business continuity. I don't want to call it like that, because when I do that in my home, then I have an empty room. But everyone understands that's a good way at least to reach someone. I think it's worse when someone stands alone. I think that's what we heard from Colm yesterday. I stop. Thank you.
See the way she asked for more time, and I thought, oh yeah, it's another 10 seconds, and 3 minutes later. You can see why she's so, like, you know, why she's so good at what she does. So 3 really important conversations that we have had there in terms of the experience of going online, the organizational side of it from Fran's point of view, and from Rosa's case, that implementation and that helping people to adapt and learn and have those services available. And even gone back to, as I say, just the use of the telephone, where people want to be anonymous, but they want to make that first touch. So I think these are all really important. Now, I spoke to Levant just before we started, so he said that they were delaying tonight's event, so we'd have much more time. And because I told them that everybody would have a question. So that does give us just another hour and a half or so, doesn't it? So no more than 10 more minutes, and we absolutely will wrap up. Now, if anybody knows me from my day job, which you don't, it's the students that I learn their names off that always get very fearful at this moment. And I can now see all the people that I've met over the last 24 hours are going, if he asks me, I'm not going. So before I resort to actually asking Peter Crory or Dimna or Michelle whether they would like to volunteer a question, I'd ask anybody else if you would like to raise your hand, and I will bring down a COVID-free microphone for you to ask the question of our audience. Is there mics on? There are? Good. Here, I'll pass this one down. If you can just pass that back to Michelle.
This question is for Rosa. It was really interesting to hear everything that you did to create access to all, to helpers, to professional helpers. I love that. My query is really very technical. I mean, what platforms are you using? Are these bespoke? Is everything built for you, or have you found kind of off-the-shelf technology that you can use in your own way?
Don't ask me to. I'm not from the IV departments, but they did some measured work. But we used existing systems. Otherwise, you can't afford it. But I think it's a general platform. If you ask me on this, ma'am, what's the machinery under it, I can't tell you. But that's what we used, and it's an open form because everyone in the country wants to use it. And to give you an idea, we started 1 year ago with the Helpers platform, and it is already used by I believe about 25,000 people who came there. And later on we started with professional helpers, and that's a lower number, but it has a big development. You see that a lot of doctors and nurses have a lot of questions. Young people arrive in a hospital and they don't know what to do with, and now we have the direct connection at least to tell them what they can do on that moment. Yes.
Thanks, Rosa. Any next question? I'm not going to say any more because there's obviously loads. Oh yeah, sorry, what's his name? Ruben, over here into the middle for Dimna.
Hi, it's another question for Rosa. You mentioned peer-to-peer support groups, that you set them up online. How were they monitored? Were they monitored with somebody from your organisation?
Yes, we have different kind of communities. We have open communities, so people just come there, put something on the wall, the virtual wall, and leave it there or take something from the wall, because we organize there all kind of information for certain groups. So we have certain groups, but we have also closed communities, so people can make that choice and no one knows about it. To give you an idea, we have communities also from the victims of MH17, and that's a closed community. So, and there is a facilitator, someone who facilitates and take care of it. And in the background there are specialists who we can ask for more questions. And there is always an ambassador also, so someone who has that experience himself. So that's also in these groups.
Thank you, Rosa. Quick show of hands. How many people in here are not using a hybrid model? So this is something obviously that you've adapted to through necessity. And I think one of the questions I have for the panel, and it's a little bit through my own experiences, is the loss of non-verbal communication. Which is something that my wife's in the audience, and she works with young children in trauma, and it's something that is that we discuss very often. And I'm just wondering if I ask you, Christine, because you were talking a lot about people who wish to approach you through the telephone and to be anonymous. How do your therapists and your helpers, how do they feel at that lack of non-verbal in relation to, and I know this might sound a bit crass, but your job satisfaction of how you work and how you help people?
It's interesting. It's interesting, that question, because even in the therapeutical process, as a psychologist used to do, the use of other means than not face-to-face is a good thing, because in the process people have different phases in their own evolution regarding the trauma, regarding the fear of speaking about something is not good. So you can have different steps, use different tools in the evolution of the process of treatment or something. So this is can see, for me as a psychologist, for example, we can see this in this way. You can analyze the situation of the victim, and then we discuss it with the victim the best way to work in the problem. So we can do that.
Did you have to retrain your own therapists and counsellors in the different approaches to doing that? Because
it's important to have procedures to do that. For example, in Portugal, our psychological professional group made procedure for the psychologists to use in the pandemic situation and to use in therapy, for example. And this can be used in several contexts, in clinical setting, but also in victim setting and every settings. It's important to have procedures, to have protocols to do that, because we are working with people suffering, so we need how to control our own anxiety to use something is not usual for us. So this is also important to have in mind. It's not just to do something. We must have in mind the impact that our methodology have in our interaction with persons. So this is important.
Okay. Yeah, it reminds me of one of my first counselling sessions, and I went to a therapist, and he was an old hippie type guy. But he was exactly the type of guy I needed to talk to, because structural counselling was probably a little bit soon for me. I needed to open up. He just asked a question, and then he sat there. And we looked at each other. And the non-verbal connection that we were having, where he was saying, it's okay, it's grand, it's okay, take your time, no rush. And we must have sat there forever until eventually I felt in a safe place where I could talk. That is obviously much harder to do online. It's much more easier to be distracted. But I think, again, Christina, what you're saying is that the policies and procedures in place before you take that step, I think, are really important, so that people like you who are delivering these services and organising these services have an understanding of what to expect, regardless of the IT systems that we end up using. I'm going to take one more question from Tobias. I know I pronounced that wrongly, Tobias, but my apologies.
Thank you. That was perfect. Tobias from Victim Support Austria. It's not really a question, more a sort of statement or afterthought to what you actually said, Colm. And thank you for this very question, because we had the discussion in our organization as well. So when COVID came, of course, we were trying, or we were actually luckily forced to quicker implement also online services. We have a text-based chat counseling now, but there was, from some members of staff, there was really some strong reluctance to use this, and there were discussions concerning, the quality is lost, the non-verbal communication is lost, how safe are these technologies, can somebody, sort of hack into our conversation or record this? So there was some persuasion necessary, and you definitely need special training for this, especially for non-verbal communication, for text-based communication. On the other hand, I think it is the future. We will not get rid of these technologies. We should see them as an additional tool to what we can offer as organizations. And at the end of the day, I mean, the doors are always open to come to us eventually for a face-to-face session. But for many people, the online option might be a very good, easy-to-access entrance to get in touch. And I believe victims, eventually they will seek the method or the way of communication that fits them best in their situation. So what you, for instance, said, at that moment it was perfect to have somebody present but not really talking. And I think there are situations where people are absolutely comfortable with just chatting in a text-based channel. But maybe they will, a few months later, they will ask whether they can come to do a face-to-face session, for instance. So we shouldn't be afraid of using these technologies. No. Thank you.
Thank you, Tobias. Okay, we're going to finish it there. But what I do is I've actually been lucky to spend a bit of time with our panelists over the last day or so. And they have all advocated that if you want to find out more about the detail, I know Liselette and Marina have their contact details, and they can make both their slides, but also if you wish to make some personal connections, I'm sure they can facilitate that for you, because I think it's important that we learn from people that have been there and trod that path as well before us. Please, a round of applause for our fantastic panelists today. Thank you. Love it.
Thank you. Thanks to Colm, Christina, Jerome, and Rosa.